Close your eyes and let us travel to the Mongolian steppe at the height of the Mongol Empire. In 1253, a Franciscan friar named William of Rubruck reached Karakorum, a city of stone walls, and felt tense on the open grassland, which had become the Mongol capital. He had traveled 5,000 miles from the court of King Louis IX of France to reach Karakorum, the capital of the most powerful empire on earth. The Orkhon River ran low and silver through grass that bent in long waves toward the Khanbaliq Mountains on the morning of 1235, when Ögedei Khan, the third son of Genghis Khan and second Khagan of the Mongol Empire, first saw the walls of his new capital rising from the black gravel plain. You are standing on a low ridge where the steppe rolls outward in every direction, and the wind carries the smell of drying dung fuel from the cooking fires of 1,000 workers. Around you, the grass has been trampled to pale gold by the passage of carts and horses, and the sharp cold of autumn evenings is already beginning to gather in the shadows of the hills. The sky above the plateau stretches in a pale blue dome against the dark volcanic rock of the Khanbaliq range, and the sound of thousands of horses moving across grassland comes and goes like breathing. The taste of salted tea and mare's milk still lingers on your tongue from the morning offering, and somewhere below, the creak of wooden carts bearing stone from quarries marks the rhythm of the day. Ögedei Khan, born in 1186 or 1189, who had ruled as Khagan since 1229, reined his horse at the ridge's edge and looked down upon what his decree had summoned into being. The decision to build a permanent city had been delivered at a Qurultai assembly of Mongol nobles, a gathering of the princes and commanders who had carried the Mongol armies across the high plateau north of what is now the People's Republic of China and into the farthest reaches of the known world. Before Karakorum, the Mongols had no fixed capital, living as nomadic pastoralists on the steppe, and some estimates suggest their population may have numbered around 200,000 people around the year 1200, a scattering of herders and warriors whose felt tents moved with the seasons and the grass. Despite their small numbers, the Mongols had conquered the largest contiguous land empire in world history, stretching from the Korean peninsula to the plains of Hungary, and the empire's nomadic character had served them well in war. Yet Ögedei understood that dominion required a center, a place where tribute could accumulate and ambassadors could find him, where the administration of conquered peoples could be coordinated and the memory of decisions preserved in writing rather than in the fallible recitation of oral tradition. The site was chosen near the Orkhon River in the heartland of earlier steppe empires, where the Uyghurs had previously established their own domain in this same region from the 8th to 9th centuries. The Uyghur aristocracy had fled southward and westward when their empire fell to Kyrgyz attacks around 840 CE, leaving behind stone foundations and the lingering prestige of a place where steppe peoples had once built something lasting. Some Uyghur diaspora groups later found service under the Mongol Khans as scribes and administrators, bringing with them a script and a tradition of bureaucratic record-keeping that the conquering Mongols had never needed in their years of migration and raid. Ögedei, the third son of Genghis Khan, who died in December 1241, saw in this valley a convergence of practical advantage and symbolic assertion. Here the new empire would claim continuity with the old, and the Mongol presence would be anchored to a specific point on the earth. The name Karakorum may derive from Mongolian words meaning black mountains, black rock, or black gravel, and workers from across the empire spread across the site in the summer of 1235. You are walking now through the construction ground, and the sun beats upon your shoulders with a dry intensity that seems to hollow out the air itself. Around you, men from China haul timbers cut in forests 1,000 li away, while Persian stonemasons argue with Uyghur supervisors about the angle of a wall, and Korean engineers measure the flow of water from a diverted stream. The smell of drying dung fuel carries on steppe winds from the cooking fires where laborers prepare their midday meal, mingling with the dust raised by 10,000 feet and hooves. The pale blue of the sky presses down upon the dark volcanic rock of the surrounding hills, and the sharp cold of autumn evenings seems impossible in this heat, though the herders among the workers know how quickly the plateau can turn. The creak of wooden carts bearing stone from quarries marks the passage of loads that seem to never cease, and somewhere beyond the ridge, the sound of thousands of horses moving across grassland signals the arrival of another caravan of supplies. The construction of Karakorum required massive labor mobilization across the empire, and the scale of that mobilization testified to how far the Mongols had traveled from their origins as a small people on the high plateau north of what is now the People's Republic of China. Prisoners of war marched north from campaigns in Rus and Persia, their chains rattling in rhythm with the creak of wooden carts bearing stone from quarries, while skilled craftsmen volunteered or were pressed into service, drawn by the promise of steady rations or simply the impossibility of refusal. The city walls enclosed an area where felt tents continued to be pitched alongside permanent buildings, for the empire's nomadic character persisted even after the capital's founding, and the Mongol nobles who gathered at Karakorum expected to live as they had always lived, under roofs of felt that could be rolled and carried when the Khagan chose to move. Ögedei Khan, born around 1186, who had ruled as second Khagan from 1229 to 1241, understood this tension between innovation and tradition, and his city accommodated both. The first stone walls rose where only felt tents had stood before, and the sight of vertical surfaces against the horizontal vastness of the steppe struck some observers as a kind of impossibility. You are standing at the base of the rising wall, and your palm rests upon stone that still holds the warmth of the day's sun, though the sharp cold of autumn evenings is beginning to gather in the shadows. Above you, the pale blue of the sky darkens toward evening, and the dark volcanic rock of the Khangai Mountains seems to absorb the last light. The taste of salted tea and mare's milk is offered again by a passing servant, and you accept it, feeling the warmth spread through your chest as the wind rises. The creak of wooden carts bearing stone from quarries has ceased for the day, and in the sudden quiet, you can hear the murmur of workers speaking in a dozen languages, the empire's many tongues finding temporary common purpose in this valley. The tension between nomadic tradition and the new permanence of imperial power ran through every aspect of Karakorum's early years, and it shaped the city that emerged from the black gravel plain. The city served as capital of the Mongol Empire from 1235 to 1260, and during those decades, it reportedly grew from a construction site into a functioning center of administration and commerce, though it never became a dense residential metropolis in the manner of Chinese or Persian cities. Karakorum functioned as an administrative and commercial hub, a place where ambassadors came to present credentials, and where the accumulated wealth of Eurasia was sorted, stored, and redirected according to the Khagan's will. The arrival of craftsmen and laborers from across the conquered territories transformed the valley of the Orkhon into a microcosm of the empire itself, and the diversity of their origins testified to the reach of Mongol arms. You are walking now through the quarter where Chinese artisans have established their workshops, and the air carries the scent of lacquer and hot metal. Around you, the sound of hammers on bronze competes with the murmur of Persian spoken by merchants examining bolts of silk, while the creak of wooden carts bearing stone from quarries gives way to the softer rumble of wheels carrying grain from the agricultural colonies that feed the construction crews. The pale blue of the sky has faded to a translucent grey, and the dark volcanic rock of the surrounding hills merges with the gathering dusk. The sharp cold of autumn evenings settles into your sleeves as you pause at a doorway, and the taste of salted tea and mare's milk is replaced by the aroma of Chinese noodles boiling in a pot, tended by a woman whose ancestors had never seen the steppe before her capture. Ögedei Khan, the third son of Genghis Khan, who had ruled as second Khagan from 1229 to 1241, visited the site repeatedly during the construction, and each visit found more permanence than the last. The decision to build a permanent city represented a radical break from nomadic tradition, yet Ögedei implemented it with the same pragmatism that had characterized his governance of the empire's daily affairs. Born in 1186 or 1189, he had inherited an apparatus of conquest and begun the slower work of consolidation, establishing taxation systems, postal relay stations, and the administrative routines that would outlast any single campaign. The Khagan seems to have found satisfaction in the naming of his capital, a grounding in the specific qualities of the place where it stood rather than in the grand abstractions that might have appealed to a more cosmopolitan ruler. The Uyghurs who had previously established their steppe empire in this same region from the 8th to 9th centuries had left traces that the new builders encountered and incorporated: stone foundations that became cellars, irrigation channels that were cleared and extended. The Uyghur aristocracy had fled southward when their empire fell to Kyrgyz attacks around 840 CE. But their diaspora preserved knowledge of this valley and its potential, and some Uyghur diaspora groups later found service under the Mongol Khans as scribes and administrators, finding in the new empire a continuity of function, if not of sovereignty. You are standing now at the edge of the Uyghur quarter, where the script on a shop sign curves in characters older than the Mongol nation, and the sound of a lute being tuned drifts from an upper window. The sharp cold of autumn evenings has deepened into the first true chill of the season, and you pull your coat closer as the smell of drying dung fuel carries on steppe winds from the fires that warm the rooms where documents are copied and accounts are reckoned. The pale blue of the sky has surrendered to a darkness pricked with stars, and the dark volcanic rock of the Khangai Mountains is visible only as a deeper absence against the glowing horizon. The taste of salted tea and mare's milk returns as a memory of morning, and the creak of wooden carts bearing stone from quarries has given way to the silence of a city preparing for sleep. The empire's nomadic character persisted even after the capital's founding, and the Mongol nobility continued to maintain their herds and their seasonal movements, visiting Karakorum for assemblies and dispersing again across the steppe when business concluded. The grandest architectural achievements were often the most portable. The silver tree designed by Parisian craftsmen, whose branches dispense fermented mare's milk from 4 pipes representing the cardinal directions, stood in a hall that could be emptied and refilled according to the Khagan's presence or absence. The site lies at the foot of the Khangai Mountains in present-day Mongolia, and the specific qualities of that location shaped the experiences of those who built and inhabited the capital. You're climbing a low hill to the west of the city, and your boots slip on the black gravel that gives Karakorum its name. The wind carries the smell of drying dung fuel from the cooking fires below, and the sound of thousands of horses moving across grassland rises and falls with the contours of the land. The sharp cold of autumn evenings has become your constant companion now, and you pause to let your breath steady, tasting the thin air of the high plateau north of what is now the People's Republic of China. The pale blue of the sky has returned with morning, and the dark volcanic rock of the Khanbaliq range catches the first light in plains of shadow and brilliance. The creak of wooden carts bearing stone from quarries begins again with the day's labor, and somewhere below, the taste of salted tea and mare's milk marks the breakfast of workers who have come from every corner of the largest contiguous land empire in world history. Prisoners of war and conscripted laborers died on the black gravel plain, their bodies returning to the soil from which the walls rose, and the creak of wooden carts bearing stone from quarries marked not only the movement of material, but the consumption of lives measured in exhaustion and exposure. The blackness of that gravel took on additional meaning for those who worked upon it through seasons of labor that blurred into years. The city, taking shape as a gathering point for the wealth of Eurasia, attracted merchants and adventurers who traveled the routes that Mongol conquest had made safer than they had been in centuries. You are standing now at the gate where the southern road enters Karakorum, and the morning light falls upon a caravan of camels kneeling to be unloaded, their packs containing porcelain from Jingdezhen, carpets from Kerman, and amber from the Baltic shores that have changed hands a dozen times since their extraction. The sharp cold of autumn evenings seems distant in this press of bodies and commerce, though the pale blue of the sky reminds you how quickly the plateau can turn. The dark volcanic rock of the Khanbaliq Mountains frames the northern horizon, and the taste of salted tea and mare's milk is offered by a hostler who has learned that this is the proper greeting for all who enter the Kargan city. The third son of Genghis Khan had established the pattern that his successors would follow, the rhythm of assembly and dispersal, the combination of nomadic mobility with administrative fixity that characterized Mongol governance at its most effective. In the decades after Ögedei's death, the city continued to accumulate the wealth and the populations that his decree had set in motion, the creak of wooden carts bearing stone from quarries gradually giving way to the softer sounds of a mature city going about its business. You are sitting now on the ridge where Ögedei first surveyed his capital, and the afternoon has lengthened into a golden hour that seems to suspend the passage of time. The grass bends under wind in long waves that match the rhythm of your breathing, and the smell of drying dung fuel carries on steppe winds from fires being kindled for the evening meal. The sound of thousands of horses moving across grassland has faded to an occasional distant drumming, and the sharp cold of autumn evenings begins to gather in the lengthening shadows. The pale blue of the sky deepens toward a color that has no name, and the dark volcanic rock of the Khanbaliq Mountains seems to glow with absorbed light. The taste of salted tea and mare's milk lingers at the back of your throat, and you understand, sitting here, why a people who had lived in motion chose this place to stop, why the black gravel plain seemed to offer something that the endless grass could not. Karakorum functioned as an administrative and commercial hub rather than a dense residential metropolis, and its population fluctuated with the seasons and the Kargan's movements, swelling during Quriltai assemblies and thinning to a maintenance corps when the court traveled elsewhere. The name Karakorum derives from Mongolian words meaning black mountains, black rock, or black gravel, and the blackness of the plain persisted beneath the construction, visible in the gaps between buildings and in the soil that blew across the streets on windy days. You are walking now through the streets of the mature city, and the dust rises softly with each step, coating your boots in the fine black powder that is the city's signature. Around you, the smell of drying dung fuel carries on steppe winds from the hearths of 100 households, and the sound of thousands of horses moving across grassland is replaced by the closer noises of commerce and administration. The chime of Chinese coins being counted, the rustle of Persian documents being sorted, the lowing of cattle being driven to slaughter. The sharp cold of autumn evenings has given way to a milder season, and the pale blue of the sky holds a warmth that seems to penetrate the stones themselves. The dark volcanic rock of the surrounding hills has softened in the gentler light, and the creak of wooden carts bearing stone from quarries has been replaced by the softer creak of carts bearing goods from the ends of the empire, the accumulated wealth of Eurasia finding its way to this central point. That mobilization established patterns of resource extraction and human movement that would characterize Mongol governance for generations. The creak of wooden carts bearing stone from quarries giving way to the more complex logistics of empire. The Mongol population numbered only around 200,000 people around the year 1200, and the felt tents that continued to be pitched within the city walls served as a reminder of how small a proportion of the empire's total population the conquerors actually constituted, how narrow the base upon which their dominion rested. You are standing at the center of Karakorum now, where the main roads intersect, and the evening has come on with a gradualness that seems to match the city's own tempo. The sharp cold of autumn evenings returns as the sun descends, and you feel it in your fingertips as you stand in the gathering darkness. The pale blue of the sky has deepened to a color between indigo and black, and the dark volcanic rock of the Khanbaliq mountains has become indistinguishable from the night. You are standing in the interior of Ögedei Khan's palace tent, the great jur that rises within the stone walls of Karakorum. Around you, the layers of felt hang heavy and thick, each stratum pressed and repressed until the wind finds no purchase. The wooden frame above you curves in its traditional crown, the uni, from which smoke now threads in a thin column toward the opening at the apex, carrying with it the particular sweetness of dung fire burning steady and low. The poles lean inward to meet at that central ring, each one painted with the red and blue geometries that Chinese artisans applied in the autumn of 1236, when Ögedei first commanded this residence to be erected within his new capital. You feel the warmth spreading through the enclosed space, and you notice how the smoke ascends in a continuous, lazy thread, drawn upward by the pressure of warmer air against the cold sky beyond. The texture of compressed earth floors beaten smooth extends beneath your feet across the full span of this enormous circular dwelling, 60 feet across at its widest point, the largest jur ever constructed according to records kept in Uyghur script. Ögedei Khan, who died in December 1241, leaving the capital still developing, had insisted upon this traditional form despite the stone foundations that his Chinese engineers had raised around it. The contrast between stone and felt creates a strange marriage of permanence and motion, as though the earth itself had been asked to hold something never meant to stay. You run your palm along the interior wall where felt meets stone, feeling the cold of the lower material seeping upward, held at bay only by the thickness of the wool above. Outside, the metallic ring of a blacksmith's hammer sounds from the workshop quarter, a regular percussion marking the hours of this city since its founding in the reign of Ögedei's father. The Mongol Empire under Ögedei continued expanding into Eastern Europe and China, and with that expansion came the need for arrowheads by the 100,000, for blades and harness rings and the iron fittings that would secure the loads of empire. The blacksmiths worked in precincts assigned by a city plan that divided functional areas deliberately, reflecting both Mongol encampment patterns and administrative needs. With that sound comes the smell of tanned leather and rendered fat from processing workshops where the hides of countless sheep and cattle were transformed into the materials of war and domestic life. The bleating of sheep being driven through the gates at dusk reaches you, a sound that carries across the open spaces between stone enclosures. The city's population swelled during Quariltai assemblies and remained modest at other times, but the herds were constant, moving through in regular cycles of slaughter and preservation, their wool shorn for felt, their bones ground for glue, their fat collected in leather sacks for winter burning. The surrounding steppe provided pasture for imperial horse herds grazing in rotation across the valley of the Orkhon River, from which water was drawn for the city's needs, supplemented by local springs rising through gravel and clay. You feel cold ere moving across your face as a servant lifts the heavy felt door covering, admitting a messenger whose boots carry the dust of roads leading to the edges of the known world. Chinese artisans were among the primary builders of the city's permanent structures, and their influence extends even here into the details of the Khan's own residence, which maintained the traditional form despite their recommendations for more lasting materials. They had constructed vaulted storage cellars beneath the administrative quarter, stone chambers where grain and dried meat could be kept through summer against winter scarcity. You are shown one such cellar now, descending steps cut into earth, feeling the temperature drop with each foot of descent until your breath shows faint in the lamplight. Chinese engineers had perfected techniques of compression and arching that would bear the weight of earth above without collapsing, and you trace with your finger the seams where their bricks meet, each one marked with a thumbprint pressed into wet clay. The seasonal rhythm of the court, migrating between summer and winter quarters, means that even this palace tent stands empty for half the year, its felt stored in chests of Chinese lacquer, its frame disassembled and bundled in protective coverings of oiled leather. Mongol nobles continue to maintain seasonal camps outside the city proper, preferring open grass to the confines of stone, and Ögedei himself had spent his summers in the cooler elevations of the Khanbaliq mountains, returning only when first snows began to whiten the steppe. You imagine this space in its season of abandonment, the compressed earth floors gathering only dust of disuse, the dung fire cold and blackened, the smoke no longer threading through the roof opening, but held in memory only, a warmth persisting in the mind when the body has moved elsewhere. The first snowfall of winter transforms the city's appearance overnight, as you will observe when morning comes. The stone walls, which provided protection primarily against wind rather than enemy attack, become ridges of white, their height exaggerated by accumulation, their gaps filled and smoothed until the city seems a single continuous form rising from the level plain. Winter temperatures on the Mongolian plateau regularly fall below -30 degrees Celsius, and the planners of Karakorum understood that survival depended upon the management of wind above all other considerations. The walls run in angular patterns that break the force of steppe gales, creating sheltered spaces where the smoke of 10,000 fires can rise without being torn immediately sideways, where warmth can accumulate rather than dissipate in moving air. You are walking now through the quarter where permanent structures included storehouses, workshops, and official residences, each marked by curved tile roofs that Chinese artisans had introduced, though here the tiles are of local manufacture, thicker and heavier than those of the Yellow River Valley, shaped to withstand the weight of snow and the expansion of frost. The capital served as a point of muster for military campaigns, and in these storehouses the equipment of war is stacked in ordered abundance. Bows wrapped in silk against dry air, quivers of arrows whose flights have been checked by specialists, armor of lacquered leather scales that will stiffen in extreme cold and must be warmed before battle. You see the scribes at work in the official residences, their brushes moving across paper with the soft scratching that is the sound of empire translating itself into enduring form, the Uyghur script they employ having been adopted by the Mongols for this administrative purpose. The arrival of messengers from armies in Poland and Persia interrupts the winter routine, as it has interrupted previous years. They come on horses ridden to the edge of endurance, their hooves wrapped in leather against ice, their breath freezing in crusts upon their nostrils. The capital served also as a point of return, where news flowed back from advancing edges of conquest, where Ögedei would sit in his great jur and receive reports of cities taken, of kings humbled, of vast distances his armies had crossed in his name. You watch a messenger now as he is helped from his horse, his fingers too stiff to unclasp his own cloak, his face showing the marks of wind burn and exhaustion of weeks in the saddle. The smell of tanned leather and rendered fat grows stronger as you move downwind, toward the precinct where hides are transformed from raw material to finished goods. Here the work continues through winter months, the cold actually preserving materials in their intermediate states, preventing the rot that would claim them in warmer climates. With each expansion came new techniques, new patterns, new demands upon the artisans who labor in this quarter. You observe a worker stretching a hide upon its frame, his movements mechanical with repetition, his hands stained dark with solutions that transform flesh into durability. The texture of compressed earth extends even here into the most utilitarian spaces, a surface that can be swept clean, that does not hold moisture or harbor insects that would flourish in wooden flooring. The bleating of sheep comes again, a later flock than the first, their wool grown thick for the season, their bodies pressed close for warmth as they move. The surrounding steppe provided pasture for imperial horse herds, but also for these humbler animals, the sheep that were the true foundation of Mongol life, the source of felt and food, and the fat that burned in lamps and the bones worked into tools and toys and crossbow triggers. Water was drawn from the Orkhon River and local springs for their processing, for washing wool and boiling carcasses, and you see steam rising from vats where the day's slaughter is being prepared, a white column joining the smoke of dung fires in the colorless sky. You return to the interior of Ögedei's palace tent, the great jur that is the symbolic center of this city, that is itself the center of the world, as its inhabitants understand the world to be. The layers of felt hang as you left them, the dung fire still burning in its iron basin, the smoke threading through the roof, opening in its unceasing ascent. The wooden frame above you catches the lamplight in its complex intersections, a structure that is both architecture and mathematics, both shelter and statement. Ögedei chose this form deliberately, understanding that power in the Mongol world derived from mobility, from the ability to strike camp and move, to leave stone behind and take the essential elements of dwelling upon the backs of carts and horses. The contrast between stone foundations and portable architecture is nowhere more evident than in the transition you observe now. As servants roll back heavy felt wall coverings to reveal the stone platform upon which this jur rests. The stone is precisely cut, leveled with instruments of Chinese manufacture, yet it supports a structure that could be dismantled in hours, that has been re-erected dozens of times in its existence. The city's layout reflected both Mongol encampment patterns and administrative needs, and this platform is the physical expression of that dual requirement, a permanent place for a temporary thing, a fixed point in the nomadic universe. You feel the cold of the stone through the thin felt of your boots, even as warmth reaches your face from the center of the space. The metallic ring of a blacksmith's hammer has ceased in the workshop quarter, replaced now by softer sounds of evening, the clatter of cooking vessels, the low voices of workers returning to quarters. The city plan divided functional areas deliberately, and this means that transition from work to rest follows geographical lines, whole streets falling silent while others remain active. You walk through the quarter of Chinese artisans, among permanent structures with curved tiles and raised foundations that speak of a different relationship with weather, with time, with the expectation that buildings should outlive their builders. The Chinese engineers who had directed the construction of vaulted storage cellars had also raised these residences, and their methods show in every joint and bracket. The seasonal rhythm of the court creates a pattern of presence and absence that defines the city's emotional life. When the Khan is here, in this great jur upon its stone platform, the city is alert, animated, its population swelled during Quirriltai assemblies and the ordinary business of governance. When he departs for summer pastures, something essential departs with him, and the city continues in a lower key, its functions reduced to maintenance and preparation, its spaces occupied by those who remain to tend the permanent structures. The first snowfall transforms the city's appearance, and with the transformation comes a change in sound, in smell, in the quality of air that moves across your face. The stone wall's protection is doubled by snow that fills every gap and softens every edge, absorbing sound and returning muffled quiet to spaces that knew noise and motion in other seasons. The inhabitants have adapted their lives to this reality, their movements slowed, their commerce concentrated in essentials, their social life drawn inward to the warmth of fires and the proximity of shared breath. You feel the warmth of the dung fire more intensely now, having come in from whitening streets, the contrast between interior and exterior made sharp by the extremity of the season. The arrival of messengers from Poland and Persia is expected, has been expected for weeks. The routes they travel slowed by the same snow that transforms the city. The capital served also as terminus, where long lines of communication finally converged, where information accumulated and was transformed into knowledge, into policy, into commands that would shape the next season's movements. The preparation for these messengers' arrival includes the readying of scribes, of interpreters, of materials upon which their reports will be fixed in permanent form. You observe the scribes in their official residences, their brushes tested, their ink ground, their paper sorted by quality and intended use, the Uyghur script they employ waiting to receive the words of empire. The smell of tanned leather and rendered fat has diminished with evening, the workers having ceased their labors, the fires banked low for the night. The compressed earth retains a residual warmth from the day's activity, but it cools quickly in this climate, and you feel the transition underfoot as you move from a space recently occupied to one long abandoned. In this midwinter season, with no assembly called, the emptiness is palpable, the spaces between structures seeming larger than their architecture would suggest. Water was drawn from the Orkhon River and local springs, and even this necessity is reduced in volume. The demands of fewer people, fewer animals, the frozen sources that must be broken through with iron bars each morning. You imagine this movement, dark lines of animals against white ground, herders on their tough Mongolian ponies, dogs running flank, the whole ecology of human and animal adapting to season's demands. That expansion into Eastern Europe and China depended upon these animals, upon their endurance and their numbers, and the skill of those who bred and trained and tended them. The bleating of sheep at dusk is the sound of another herd, another adaptation, the sheep more tolerant of close confinement, their wool harvested even in the coldest months for the felt that lines the jurs and covers the bodies of the living. You are standing once more in the interior of Ögedei's palace tent, the great jur that has become familiar in its proportions, its smells, the particular quality of light filtering through felt and smoke. The layers of felt hang as they have hung since morning, but the light has changed, the day having advanced toward its brief winter close, the sun low and distant in the southern sky. The wooden frame above you casts shadows that move almost imperceptibly, the sun's angle shifting by fractions of degrees, by distances that mean nothing in human terms, but everything in longer calculations of season and climate. Ögedei would have observed these same shadows in his final winter, would have felt the same diminishment of light, the same encroachment of cold upon spaces where warmth and life were concentrated. The contrast between stone and felt seems more pronounced in this fading light, the stone cold and massive, the felt soft and yielding, the two materials speaking different languages of permanence and change. Chinese artisans had not built this great jur upon its platform, this assertion of nomadic identity against the seduction of settled life. The tension between encampment patterns and administrative needs is most evident here, most consciously maintained. You feel cold air moving across your face from the direction of the door, where a servant has lifted the covering to admit the evening's final deliveries, wood and water and fresh dung that will feed tomorrow's fires. The metallic ring of a blacksmith's hammer sounds once, twice, from some distant quarter where a repair cannot wait for morning, where urgency of war or weather demands continuation into hours of rest. Among the permanent structures, workshops were the last to fall silent, the nature of their labor often incompatible with the sun's convenience. You imagine the scene, the single lamp, the glowing iron, the hammer rising and falling in its rhythm of transformation, the worker's breath joining smoke in its ascent toward the roof opening. The smoke threads through the roof opening of this great jur as well, the dung fire maintained through the night by servants who sleep in shifts, who wait to feed the flames and return to their dreams. The seasonal rhythm will reverse itself in months to come, the days lengthening, temperatures moderating, the call of open grass becoming insistent once more. With spring the movements will begin, the slow dispersal that empties Karakorum of its aristocratic population, that leaves the city to its artisans, its scribes, its permanent residents who know no other home. The last snowfall transforms the city's appearance as surely as the first, the melting that turns white to brown, revealing what cold had hidden. Accumulated debris of months, bodies of animals that did not survive, refuse that must be cleared before the Khan's return. The flow of messengers from Poland and Persia will continue, the flow of information as constant as the flow of seasons, as the movement of herds across steppe that provided pasture for imperial horse herds. The planning for campaigns proceeds in all seasons, the logistics of movement calculated and recalculated, supplies accumulated in vaulted storage cellars that Chinese engineers had constructed beneath the administrative quarter. You descend once more into those cellars, feeling the temperature drop, watching your breath form and dissipate in lamplight, observing stacks of grain bags, sealed vessels of dried meat, materials of empire waiting for the moment of their use. Even here in the storage cellars there are markings, labels, traces of organizational systems, extending from highest policy to lowest sack of millet, recorded in Uyghur script, which the Mongols had adopted for such purposes. The compressed earth gives way here to precision of brick and mortar, Chinese engineers' craft in its most utilitarian expression. You emerge from the cellars into night, stars brilliant in the winter sky, cold, intense, and immediate after relative warmth below ground. The stone walls seem almost unnecessary in this still night, air motionless, cold descending from clear sky rather than advancing from any horizontal direction. You feel the approach of such a night, the quality of cold that seems to come from within as much as from without, the body's own warmth insufficient against vast dissipation of energy into space. The smell of tanned leather and rendered fat reaches you even here, carried on some faint movement of air you cannot detect against your skin, some last exhalation of the day's industry. The bleating of sheep has long since ceased, the animals now penned and settled, their warmth concentrated in the mass of their bodies, their breath rising in visible clouds above enclosures. The demands of expansion reached even to these humble creatures, their wool and meat and hides supporting armies that moved across distances unimaginable to previous ages. The Khan's own residence maintained the traditional form of a large felt tent, and in this consistency of form lay a message, a declaration that power did not depend upon accumulation of stone, upon the fixed and immovable, but upon capacity for movement, for adaptation, for the sudden appearance of overwhelming force where none had been expected. You return to the warmth of the dung fire, the smoke threading through the roof opening in its endless ascent, the layers of felt hanging heavy and protective against the night. The wooden frame above you catches lamplight in patterns that seem to shift with every movement of your eyes, the product of craftsmen long departed, their names unrecorded, their skill persisting in the object rather than the memory. Ögedei had created this city as a statement, a gesture toward permanence that remained nevertheless rooted in the nomadic principle, the stone serving the felt rather than replacing it, the permanent structures serving a population that remembered and, in part, continued the mobile life of their ancestors. The contrast between stone foundations and portable architecture resolves itself finally in the understanding that both serve the same end, the preservation of life and the extension of power across variations of season and climate. Chinese artisans had built in service of a vision that was not their own, translating Mongol requirements into materials and methods foreign to the steppe. You feel the warmth spreading through you as the stars emerge above the black gravel plain, the city of Ögedei Khan folding into darkness and silence, the grass bending under wind that has no end. Your own blood, in the rhythm of breath that continues when all other rhythms have paused. The long journey eastward in a prisoner column across the steppe has arrived here, in this darkness, in this stillness, in this moment when the silver tree exists as potential rather than performance, waiting for the next summons, the next banquet, the next occasion when Mongol power will demonstrate its reach through your hands and through the metal they have shaped. The acrid smell of molten metal and charcoal greets you in the workshop at dawn, and the precise ring of a small hammer on fine work resumes its seasonal rhythm, the maintenance that outlasts any single performance. The weight of silver sheet under a chasing hammer continues, for the tree requires continual renewal, the polishing of surfaces dulled by handling, the repair of channels clogged by residue, the adjustment of mechanisms strained by repetition. You are standing at your bench in the afternoon light that falls through oiled parchment windows, and around you the benches hold half-finished vessels, and the floor is scattered with curled shavings of silver that catch the light like fish scales abandoned on a shore. The silver tree grows in your mind even when your hands touch other metal, even when the commission requires simpler work, vessels and ornaments that lack the tree's complexity. The coolness of polished metal under fingers is a constant now, a sensation that belongs equally to memory and to present touch, to the tree's trunk and to the cups that pass through your workshop for repair. The flicker of lamplight on worked silver surfaces is what you imagine in the dark hours, what you anticipate in the next trial, the next banquet, the next occasion when the tree will perform its automated abundance for witnesses who will carry word to courts you cannot imagine. The sound of liquid pouring through hidden pipes is tested again and again in the intervals between performances, the engineers adjusting pressure, the assistants rehearsing timing, the whole mechanism maintained in readiness for summons that may come with little warning. The craftsmanship represented Gothic metalworking techniques transplanted to Central Asia, and this transplantation requires continual tending, the foreign rootstock never fully at home in alien soil, always needing attention that native growth might not demand. The materials for such work were sourced from Mongol-controlled silver mines, and the supply continues, the ingots arriving, the metal flowing through crucible and mold and hammer to maintain what has been created, to preserve what would otherwise pass into ruin. The presence of a French craftsman illustrates the global reach of Mongol slave-taking, and you see this reach in their faces, in the gradual dissolution of their former lives, in their eventual accommodation to workshops and quarters where no common language exists, but the shared vocabulary of material and tool. The capture of Baocha during a Mongol campaign in Eastern Europe is mentioned less frequently as the years accumulate, as newer marvels occupy the court's attention, as the Khan's reign moves toward its close. Merk Khan was born on 10 January 1209 and died on 11 August 1259 at Chongqing in present-day China. And in the final years of his reign, the Silver Tree continues its performances, continues to demonstrate what the empire can contain, what conquest can yield beyond destruction. The fountain became one of the most celebrated marvels described by visitors to Karakorum, and these visitors come with increasing frequency as the empire's stability permits travel, as the routes that brought you here become paths that others choose to follow. You are standing in the workshop when word arrives of the Khan's death, or you are standing in the hall when the news is whispered among stewards, and the Silver Tree stands in its accustomed place, its mechanism still functional, its performance still possible, though the hand that commissioned it will never again gesture for wine. The acrid smell of molten metal and charcoal persists through the transition of power, through the uncertain months when successors maneuver, when the empire's continuity is tested. The precise ring of a small hammer on fine work continues, for the tree requires maintenance regardless of who occupies the central seat, for the mechanism's functioning is independent of any single life span. The weight of silver sheet under a chasing hammer is what your body knows, what it continues to know as the years accumulate, as your own life moves toward its closing, as your fingers that once traced Gothic vines now find the patterns more difficult to hold in memory, more necessary to verify in the lamplight's flicker. The coolness of polished metal under fingers is what you feel in the final years, when the tree's performances grow less frequent, when the court's attention turns to newer commissions, to different demonstrations of power. The flicker of lamplight on worked silver surfaces becomes rarer, the banquets less elaborate, the empire's reach contracting in ways that those who stand at its center may not yet perceive. The sound of liquid pouring through hidden pipes is heard less often, the bellows chamber standing empty for longer intervals, the assistants reassigned to other tasks, the engineers seeking patrons for projects that will demonstrate their skill more immediately. The fountain served both practical and symbolic functions at court banquets, and both functions diminish as the court itself changes, as the capital shifts, as Karakorum becomes a memory rather than a presence in the empire's administration. You are standing in the workshop, or you are lying on your pallet, or you are somewhere between, and the silver tree grows in your mind as it grew in metal, as it continues to grow in the accounts of those who saw it, who heard of it, who imagined what such an object might mean. The acrid smell of molten metal and charcoal is what you remember when other memories fade, when the names of Paris streets grow uncertain, when the faces of those you left behind become indistinct in the lamplight's flicker. The coolness of polished metal under fingers is the last sensation, or one of the last, as your hands grow uncertain, as the hammer's ring becomes less precise, as the workshop's demands exceed what your aging body can supply. The sound of liquid pouring through hidden pipes is the last sound, or one of the last, as your hearing fades, as the workshop's noises blend into the continuous murmur of a life, spent in translation between Gothic and Mongol, between Paris and Karakorum, between capture and creation. You are standing in the workshop, or you are standing in the hall, or you are standing in the memory that persists when both workshop and hall have fallen to ruin, when Karakorum itself becomes archaeology, becomes text, becomes the subject of scholarly reconstruction from fragments and accounts. The acrid smell of molten metal and charcoal persists in the records, in the descriptions of workshops and foundries, in the attempt to imagine what your daily labor must have involved. The weight of silver sheet under a chasing hammer persists in the physical memory of those who have held such metal, who have felt its resistance and its yield, who understand in their own hands what your hands must have known. The coolness of polished metal under fingers is what the imagined visitor feels in the scholarly reconstruction, the museum display, the digital model that attempts to restore what time has taken. The sound of liquid pouring through hidden pipes is what the imagined guest hears, the low murmur rising to the branches, emerging from the serpents' mouths, flowing into the lions' waiting mouths below, or into cups held by those who understand the mechanism's demonstration. The silver tree grows in your mind long after your hands have ceased to touch metal, long after the workshop has fallen silent, long after Karakorum itself has become a place of mounds and foundations, of scattered debris that archaeologists sift for evidence of what once stood here. The coolness of polished metal under fingers is a sensation that persists in the record, in the attempt to imagine what the tree's surface must have felt like to those who touched it, who polished it, who maintained its shine against the tarnishing that time and handling would bring. The flicker of lamplight on worked silver surfaces is an image that persists in the descriptions, in the attempt to visualize what must have been visible to those who stood in the hall's uncertain illumination, who saw the tree appear to move, to live, to grow in the shifting light. The sound of liquid pouring through hidden pipes is a sound that persists in the accounts, in the attempt to imagine what the banquet's silence must have contained as the mechanism began its performance, as the liquid emerged from concealed sources, as the empire demonstrated its ability to make abundance appear without human labor, to make metal behave like living wood, to make captivity yield marvels that free craftsmen in their native lands might never have opportunity to create. The silver tree grows in your mind long before your hands touch its metal, and it continues to grow there long after, in the darkness between waking and sleep, in the space where memory and imagination merge, where the past becomes present not through scholarly accuracy, but through sensory immersion, through the body's participation in what the mind conceives. You are standing in the workshop where the afternoon light falls through oiled parchment windows, or you are standing in the hall where the lamplight flickers on worked silver surfaces, or you are standing in the darkness where the tree exists only in memory, and in the words that preserve memory against time's erosion. The coolness of polished metal under fingers awaits you, or has awaited you, or continues to await in the narrative's present tense that knows no past, no future, only the continuous now of description, of immersion, of the sleep that approaches as the story continues, as the hammer's ring grows distant, as the liquid's murmur fades, as the silver tree stands in stillness and in darkness, waiting for the next performance, the next witness, the next occasion when Mongol power will demonstrate its reach through metal and through liquid, and through the captivity that yielded this wonder, this marvel, this tree that grew in Karakorum and nowhere else, that grew in your mind and in your hands, and in the accounts that preserve what your hands made long after your hands have ceased to move, long after the workshop has fallen silent, long after the empire that commissioned it has dissolved into the histories that attempt to contain what no history can fully contain, the sensation of metal under fingers, the flicker of light on silver, the sound of liquid pouring through pipes that no eye observes, no hand touches, no memory except the narrative's own preserves against the darkness that gathers, that deepens, that welcomes the sleeper into the sleep that the narrative accompanies, that the voice continues to offer even as consciousness recedes, even as the silver tree grows small in the mind's distant view, even as the steppe wind finds every gap, and the grass bends under wind that has no end. The first light of dawn spreads across the eastern sky above Karakorum, and you are standing at the edge of the Muslim quarter as the call to prayer begins. The rhythmic murmur of Arabic prayer rises from the minaret in a voice that is carried across deserts and mountains, across the impossible distances that your life has spanned. A merchant from Samarkand passes you with soft leather slippers on his feet, his breath visible in the cold morning air as he moves toward the mosque, where others are already gathering. The cold air moves across your face, carrying with it the smell of ovens being stoked for the first bread of the day, and you notice how the quarter has begun to wake in layers, each household stirring according to its own understanding of what morning means. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes from the previous night's caravan, their bales of silk and their bundles of spices still smelling of the road from Bukhara. The Muslim quarter housed merchants and craftsmen from the Islamic world, men who had followed the Silk Road to this city at the heart of the Mongol Empire, and you see their faces now in the half-light, bearded and calm, with the composure of those who have measured their lives in leagues and in seasons. A camel groans somewhere beyond the first row of mud-brick dwellings, and the sound is answered by the lowing of cattle in a pen nearby. The sky above Karakorum is pale green at the horizon, fading upward into a grey that holds the promise of later blue, and the smoke from 100 hearth fires rises in thin columns that bend with the wind. The call to prayer continues, and the words reach you not as command, but as invitation, as the sound of a community marking its place in time. Karakorum contained distinct quarters for different religious and ethnic communities, and this division was not a wall but a rhythm, a way of allowing many truths to coexist without demanding that any single one overwhelm the others. You walk now between low walls where apricot trees have been trained to grow flat against the brick, their bare branches casting shadows that seem to write on the surfaces behind them. A child emerges from a doorway with a wooden bucket, her feet bare on the packed earth despite the chill, and she does not look at you as she passes because her mind is already at the well, already calculating the weight of water she will carry back. The rhythmic murmur of Arabic prayer fades as the last worshippers enter the mosque, and the street holds a sudden stillness that seems almost deliberate, as if the quarter itself has drawn breath. You continue through lanes where the overhang of second stories narrows the sky to a ribbon of light, where carpets hang from windows to air in the cold, their patterns of crimson and indigo visible even in this dimness. The Muslim merchants were prominent in the long-distance trade along the Silk Road, and their prominence here is written in the width of these streets, in the solidity of the caravanserai that occupies the quarter's center, in the confidence with which the architecture declares that this faith has found a home far from its birthplace. A dog sleeps in a patch of sunlight that has finally broken through, its body curved around itself like a question mark, and you step around it with the care that strangers learn in cities not their own. By mid-morning, you have passed through the gate that marks the boundary between the Muslim quarter and the Chinese quarter, and the transition reveals itself first in the sound of different languages, then in the smell of different cooking. The Chinese quarter accommodated artisans and administrators from northern China, men who had brought with them the habits of Kaifeng and Luoyang, the techniques of porcelain and the protocols of bureaucracy. You see a workshop where a man is grinding ink stick against stone, his circular motion hypnotic in its regularity, and the black liquid gathering in the reservoir seems to you like a kind of concentrated night, something that could be used to write the darkness into visibility. Around you, merchants are unloading their cargoes of raw lacquer and bamboo paper, their movements economical and silent compared to the voluble exchanges you have left behind. The smell of sandalwood incense from a Buddhist altar reaches you before you see the temple, and you follow it through a doorway that stands open to the street, as if the building itself were breathing. Inside, the light falls from high windows in beams that hold visible dust, and the smoke of incense rises in spirals that seem to trace the path of prayers ascending. The city contained 12 pagan temples, presumably Buddhist or shamanic in character, and though this is only one of them, it carries within its walls the accumulated devotion of generations. You stand at the threshold and watch as a woman bows before an image of the Buddha, her forehead touching the mat 3 times in a gesture that requires no translation. The smoke drifts across the space between you, and you find that you are holding your own breath, as if to breathe would be to disturb something that exists only in stillness. The clang of the bronze temple bell marks the hour, and the sound reverberates in your chest in a way that seems to belong to the body rather than to the ear. You remain in the temple courtyard as the bell's resonance fades into the larger silence of the city, watching a monk sweep fallen leaves into a pattern that will itself be scattered by the next wind. The physical separation of quarters allowed communities to maintain distinct practices, and this separation is visible in the architecture of the temple, in its upturned eaves, and in the guardian lions that flank its gate, creatures that would seem outlandish in the mosque you left hours before. Yet there is no tension in this difference, only the fact of coexistence, the acceptance that Karakorum has become a place where many worlds have agreed to overlap. A bird calls from the roof ridge, and the monk looks up with a face that holds no expression you can read. The taste of unleavened bread at a Christian communion is still hours away, but you find yourself anticipating it as you leave the temple precinct and walk toward the quarter where the Nestorian community has built their church. The Uyghurs of the Tarim Basin had practiced Buddhism, Nestorian Christianity, Manichaeism, and Zoroastrianism, and this history of multiple faiths has prepared the ground for what you will find there, a Christianity that bears the marks of its long journey eastward from the Mediterranean. The sky above you has cleared to a depth of blue that seems almost artificial, and the steppe wind carries the smell of distant rain, though no clouds are visible. You pass a group of children who are playing a game with sheep knuckler bones, their voices rising and falling in the universal cadence of play that needs no shared language to be understood. A Christian church served the Nestorian Christian community at the Mongol court, and this church stands now before you with its distinctive cross visible above the surrounding walls, a cross that bears extra bars near its top and bottom in the style that has marked this community since its centuries in Persia. Nestorian Christianity had reached China centuries before the Mongol period, carried by monks who had walked the Silk Road when it was still a more tentative thing, when each oasis required negotiation and each mountain pass demanded faith in something beyond the visible. You enter through a gate where an old woman sits with a basket of dried apricots for sale, and she nods to you with the indifference of one who has seen many strangers pass, who understands that in Karakorum the stranger is the norm rather than the exception. Inside the church courtyard, preparations are underway for the Palm Sunday that approaches, and you see the visual contrast of white Nestorian vestments against the steppe landscape as the deacons bring out the woven palms that will be distributed to the faithful. The white fabric seems to glow in the afternoon light, to hold within itself a quality of illumination that belongs more to snow than to cloth, more to the idea of purity than to any material thing. You stand apart and watch as the priests rehearse their procession, their movements deliberate and ancient, their voices rising in Syriac syllables that have echoed through centuries of worship in places as distant as Kerala and Chang'an. The Silk Road connected the Mediterranean with East Asia via Central Asian routes, and this connection is made visible here in the faces of the worshippers who begin to gather, some with features that speak of Syrian ancestry, others with the broad cheekbones of the steppe. The quiet of each quarter as its inhabitants observed their own rituals settles over the Nestorian church as the rehearsal ends and the priests withdraw. You remain in the courtyard, listening to the sound of your own breathing, aware of how the silence here differs from the silence of the Buddhist temple, from the silence of the mosque at prayer's end. The competition for influence among religious groups was common at court, but here in the quarters the competition is muted, transformed into the simpler fact of proximity, of lives lived in parallel rather than in opposition. A cat emerges from behind a storage jar and crosses the courtyard with the liquid gait of an animal that has never been hurried, and you follow its passage with your eyes until it disappears through a gap in the wall. Evening finds you at the edge of the city, where the Mongol encampment spreads in a pattern that repeats the ancient arrangements of the steppe. The Mongols themselves maintained traditional shamanic practices alongside openness to other religions, and this openness is not contradiction but strategy, the recognition that power over many peoples requires accommodation of many truths. You are standing at the entrance to a circle of jurs, the felt dwellings that can be dismantled and moved with the seasons, and the smell of juniper in a shamanic purification rite reaches you from somewhere within the largest of these structures. The smoke carries with it the memory of forests that do not grow here, of high valleys where the tree is gathered for exactly this purpose, for the cleansing of spaces and of spirits before important undertakings. A shamanic ceremony at the Khan's tent for a military campaign is being prepared, and you observe from the respectful distance that custom demands as figures in traditional dress move between the jurs with the urgency of those who know that dawn will bring departure. The Khan himself is not yet visible, but his presence is announced by the clustering of officials, by the horses being saddled in readiness, by the general atmosphere of a power that is about to extend itself across the steppe. Religious tolerance was a practical policy facilitating rule over diverse populations, and this practicality is nowhere more evident than here, where the shamanic drums will sound tonight in a ceremony that coexists with the mosque's call and the temple's bell and the church's procession, none demanding the extinction of the others. The sky above the encampment is deepening toward the indigo of full night, and the first stars are appearing in a clarity that the city's smoke would have dimmed. The rhythmic murmur of Arabic prayer has long since ceased, but you remember it now as you watch the shamanic preparations, the way that sound layered itself against the other sounds of morning, creating a texture rather than a conflict. A shaman emerges from the largest jur, his costume hung with small mirrors that catch the last light and throw it back in fragments, his face painted with markings that you cannot interpret, but that you recognize as language, as a system of signs that communicates with powers beyond the ordinary. The smoke of juniper grows thicker, and you feel it in your throat, the astringent quality that seems to clear not just the air but something in the mind itself, some accumulation of doubt or of weariness that has settled there without your noticing. The shaman begins to move in a pattern that is half dance and half struggle, his body becoming the vehicle for something that speaks through him rather than from him. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, though there is no harbour here, only the metaphor that insists itself upon you, the sense that all these faiths are vessels that have arrived from distant shores, that have found in Karakorum a common anchorage. The Khan emerges now from his jur, his face impassive, as he watches the ceremony that is being performed for his benefit, for the success of the campaign that will carry Mongol arms westward toward territories where other faiths predominate, where the practical policy of tolerance will be tested anew. The shaman's movements grow more rapid, and the mirrors on his costume create a flickering that seems to belong to fire rather than to reflected light. You feel the cold air moving across your face, colder now that night has fully arrived, and you pull your own garments closer as the ceremony reaches its intensity. The smoke has begun to thin, suggesting that the burning has reached its end, that the space has been cleansed and prepared for what will follow. The Khan steps forward to receive the shaman's blessing, and you observe the formality of the gesture, the way that power here accommodates itself to tradition, requires the sanction of practices that predate its own existence. The ceremony concludes, and the encampment settles into the particular quiet that precedes a departure, a quiet that holds within it the anticipation of movement, of the transformation that tomorrow will bring. You withdraw from the circle of jurs and walk back toward the city, toward the quarters where other rituals have ended or are continuing in their own time. You pass through the boundaries between them now as a kind of journey, each marked by a change in the quality of light, in the smell of cooking, in the language that drifts from open doorways. A dog barks somewhere in the Chinese quarter, and the sound is answered from the Muslim quarter, creating a call and response that seems almost deliberate, a canine version of the human negotiations that have made this city possible. Theological debates held before the Khan between rival clerics have become part of the city's legend, and though no such debate is occurring tonight, you find yourself imagining it as you walk, the assembly of representatives from each faith, each arguing for the superiority of his own understanding, while the Khan listened with the patience of one who has learned that power is maintained by comprehension rather than by commitment. The Mongol Khans consulted religious specialists from multiple traditions, and this consultation was itself a form of rule, a way of demonstrating that no single truth could claim exclusive sovereignty in a realm that stretched from the Pacific to the plains of Hungary. You pass a group of men seated around a brazier in the street, their faces lit from below by the coals, their voices low in discussion that you cannot overhear and that you do not try to understand. The building is closed, its gates secured for the night, but the scent persists, as if it has become part of the structure itself, absorbed into the wood and the brick during years of burning. You place your hand on the wall and feel the residual warmth of the day's sun, a warmth that seems to belong to the building's own metabolism, its slow process of taking in and giving out. The clang of the bronze temple bell sounds in your memory, though no bell rings now, and you stand in the darkness with this remembered resonance, letting it fill the space where the shaman's drums have only recently fallen silent. You continue walking, not toward any destination, but in the manner of one who has become part of the city's own wakefulness, its necessary counter-rhythm to the general slumber. The stars above Karakorum are brilliant in a way that city dwellers in other places have forgotten, each point of light seeming to press its individual claim on your attention, to demand a recognition that you find yourself unable to give, your mind too scattered, too saturated with the day's impressions to focus on any single thing. The taste of unleavened bread at a Christian communion returns to you unbidden, though you did not receive communion at the Nestorian church, only observed from the courtyard's edge. The taste is memory or imagination, you cannot determine which, but it carries with it the texture of dryness, the slight resistance of the bread to immediate dissolution, the way that it requires saliva, requires participation to become fully food. This is the nature of ritual, you think, or would think if thinking were still possible in the ordinary way, the requirement that the participant become involved, that the observer transform into the observed. The visual contrast of white Nestorian vestments against the steppe landscape persists in your inner vision, and you see it now against the darkness, a kind of afterimage that floats before you as you walk. Dawn will bring the call to prayer again, will begin the cycle that you have traced through this single day, and you find yourself already anticipating it, already positioned in imagination at the edge of the Muslim quarter as the first light spreads and the first voice rises. The rhythmic murmur of Arabic prayer has become for you the signature of this city's morning, the announcement that another day of coexistence has begun, that the impossible distances have been once more temporarily bridged. You pass the mosque now in darkness, its minaret a silhouette against the starfield, and you hear from within the sound of someone stirring, preparing the space for the worship that will begin in hours still to come. Ideas and religions diffused along these routes alongside commercial goods, and this diffusion is not merely historical, but continuous, occurring even now in the darkness as you walk, in the dreams of those who sleep in the quarters you pass, dreams that may carry images from faiths other than their own, that may prepare the ground for tomorrow's encounters, for the debates and the negotiations and the simple facts of proximity that make up the life of this city. The smoke of juniper has left your lungs now, has been replaced by the ordinary air of night, but you carry the memory of its quality, the particular way that it seemed to clarify rather than to obscure. You find yourself at the center of Karakorum, at a point where the quarters meet in a plaza that has no name or has too many names, each community claiming it in its own cartography. Here a fountain plays in darkness, its water catching starlight in fragments that seem to belong to the shaman's mirrors, to the same principle of broken and reassembled light. You sit on the fountain's rim and let the sound of falling water replace the sounds of the day, the calls and the bells and the drums. Let it become the single continuous note against which your own breathing can be measured. The flicker of lamplight on worked silver surfaces has ceased in all the quarters, but you see it still in memory, in the afterimage that persists when the lamps are extinguished. The sound of liquid pouring through hidden pipes has fallen silent, but you hear it in the pulse of water before you, in the continuous present of the fountains falling. You remain at the fountain as the night progresses toward its deepest point, the hour when even the watchmen drowse against their walls, and the city seems to belong to itself alone, without inhabitants, without observers. The first hint of light appears in the eastern sky, not yet color, but a lessening of darkness, a preparation for color that will follow. You rise from the fountain and orient yourself toward the Muslim quarter, toward the mosque where the call to prayer will soon begin again. You will pass the Nestorian church on your way, will see its cross emerging from shadow as the light strengthens, will remember the white vestments and the Syriac syllables, and the taste of bread that you did not eat but somehow know. The rhythmic murmur of Arabic prayer begins as you approach the mosque, and you stop to listen, to let the sound locate you in the city's morning, to confirm that another cycle has begun. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes from a caravan that has arrived in darkness, their movements efficient with the practice of repetition, the knowledge that this morning is like other mornings, that the trade continues regardless of who rules or what faith they profess. The cold air moves across your face, carrying now the first warmth of the rising sun, a warmth that seems to come from within the air itself rather than from any visible source. The call to prayer reaches its completion, and the worshippers begin to emerge from the mosque, their faces marked with the particular calm that follows concentrated devotion. You move among them now not as stranger, but as participant in the larger fact of mourning, of the city's return to consciousness after its brief withdrawal. The bronze temple bell will sound later, will mark the hour of the Buddha's remembrance, and you will hear it from wherever you have wandered by then, will receive it as part of the same continuous composition that includes the call to prayer and the shaman's drum and the Syriac chant, all the sounds that Karakorum has gathered to itself, all the faiths that are found here, not merely tolerance but place, not merely acceptance but home. The smoke of sandalwood incense will rise again, and the smoke of juniper will cleanse another space, and the taste of unleavened bread will satisfy another hunger, and the white vestments will mark another procession, and you will be somewhere in this city, walking, listening, present in the way that the sleep narration requires, the way that presence without demand makes possible, the way that Karakorum itself has perfected, holding all the harbour at acre stretches before you in the early light of May, 1253, and the Franciscan Friar William of Rubruck stands at the quayside with 2 companions, their few belongings wrapped in coarse cloth, their faces turned toward the eastern sea. The stone walls of the Crusader city rise behind them, still bearing the marks of recent siege, and the scent of olive oil and dust hangs in the warm Levantine air. You watch as William of Rubruck, born likely in the 1210s or 1220s in Rubruck, in the county of Flanders of the Kingdom of France, fingers the cord of his grey habit, while a Genos merchant vessel prepares to receive passengers bound for the Black Sea coast. The water laps against the harbour stones with a rhythm that seems already to belong to memory, and somewhere in the rigging above, a sailor calls out in a dialect that carries the rough music of Ligurian ports. Around you, the morning light falls in broad, honey-coloured bands across the quay, illuminating patches of dried fish scales and the pale dust of limestone. The Kingdom of Jerusalem held this coastline with a grip that history would eventually loosen. Yet for this hour, the harbour maintained its ancient function of departure and return. You feel the warmth of the stone through the thin leather of your travelling shoes, and the particular quality of Levantine morning air moves across your face with a weight that seems to press the sea's salt into your skin. A dog sleeps in the shadow of a coil of rope, its flanks rising and falling with the deep unconsciousness that travellers envy. The friar's 2 companions speak together in low Flemish tones, their words carrying the flat vowels of William of Rubruck's own childhood landscape, that territory of water meadows and willows near Castle, where the young friar first learned to observe the world with the patience that will serve him across the 5,000 miles ahead. The vessel carries them north and east through waters that grow cooler with each day's passage, and you are standing at the rail when the Crimean coast first appears as a thin line of darkness against the paler darkness of sky. William of Rubruck departed on his journey in 1253, sent by King Louis IX of France on a diplomatic and missionary mission. Some sources suggest the king may have conceived the mission during his time in the Holy Land, hoping to find in the Mongols an ally against Islam. The Franciscan friar understands the political calculations behind his commission, yet his own devotion carries him toward something more than diplomacy, toward the possibility of souls unknown to Christian teaching. The Black Sea moves beneath the hull with a motion that seems to belong to no single element, neither fully water nor fully the suggestion of land breath that rises from distant shores. The deck planks hold the memory of countless feet in their worn grain, and the salt crust on the rail comes away under your fingertips in thin, brittle flakes. Gulls wheel in the middle distance with a sound that seems to come from somewhere beyond their own bodies, a cry that the wind shapes and reshapes before it reaches your ears. The sky holds layers of cloud that shift between white and the particular grey of water-heavy atmosphere, and the horizon where sea meets sky has begun to lose its distinction, becoming instead a zone of gradual transition that the eye cannot fix with certainty. Somewhere below, in the vessel's cramped quarters, The friar writes the first entries of what will become his detailed report, his pen moving across the page with the steady pressure of a man, accustomed to recording the world as he finds it rather than as he wishes it to be. They disembark in the territory of the Golden Horde, and the long ride through the Pontic steppe north of the Black Sea begins with the acquisition of horses and the negotiation of guides who understand the network of Mongol relay stations. You are mounted now on a steppe pony, its short legs carrying you with a gait that seems closer to the rolling motion of the land itself than to the elevated pride of European destriers. The Pontic steppe stretches in all directions with a flatness that the European eye finds initially disorienting, the horizon so distant and so level that the mind reaches for architectural features that do not exist, for towers or trees or any vertical interruption of the horizontal world. The endless horizon of grass merges with sky in a way that seems to dissolve the boundary between earth and air, and you find yourself searching the distance for the familiar markers of European landscape, the church spires, the hedgerows, the patterns of cultivation that have shaped your visual expectations since childhood. The taste of fermented mare's milk is offered at every encampment, a hospitality that marks the passage from one territory to another, from one kinship network to the next. You accept the bowl that is passed to you, feeling the slight fermentation on your tongue, the sour warmth that spreads through your chest in the cooling evening. This beverage becomes, across the months of travel, a constant that measures the journey in sensory repetition rather than in the varied landmarks that would mark a European road. The tents of the nomads rise in the evenings with the efficiency of long practice, their felt walls enclosing spaces that are at once domestic and provisional, carrying the accumulated smell of smoke and grease and the particular odor of the steppe after rain. The distinctive smell of the steppe after rain reaches you on the third evening of your passage through the Pontic grasslands, a mineral freshness that rises from the soil with a quality you have not encountered in the heavier, more vegetal rain scents of Flanders. Your fingers stiffen around the leather reins as the cold of high-altitude nights settles into your bones, and you watch the process of bedding down in felts with the attention of a man learning survival in an element that does not forgive inattention. This cold becomes a rhythm of existence that divides each 24 hours into the bright labor of travel and the enclosed darkness of rest. The stars in this latitude seem to hang closer to the earth, their light falling with a clarity that the moist air of your homeland never permitted, and you find yourself waking in the deepest hours to the sound of horses shifting in their tethers, to the breathing of the men who sleep near you, to the immense silence that holds all these smaller sounds as a bowl holds water. The guttural Mongolian spoken around unfamiliar consonants reaches your ears in fragments of conversation that you cannot yet pass, the sounds forming patterns that your European palate cannot reproduce, yet you listen with the patience of a man who knows that understanding will come only through prolonged exposure. The days accumulate into weeks, and the weeks into months, and the landscape gradually alters its character as you move eastward through the Caucasus and onto the Central Asian steppe. He traveled via the Black Sea, the Caucasus, and the Central Asian steppe, and the particular sequence of these terrains imprints itself on your memory as a series of textures and temperatures, of passes where the air grew thin and valleys where it lay heavy with the scent of unfamiliar vegetation. The visual strangeness of a European face in a Mongol crowd will not fully register until you reach the denser populations of the imperial territory. Yet even in these early stages, you notice the curious glances that your companions attract, the slight pause in movement as steppe dwellers encounter features and coloring that their experience has not prepared them to expect. This strangeness becomes, across the journey, a condition of existence that you gradually internalize, learning to move through the world as an object of others' observation, even as you observe them. The grass beneath your horse's hooves changes its character with the passing of longitude, becoming at times more sparse, at times more lush, responding to patterns of rainfall and soil that the European science of agriculture has not yet mapped. You pass the skeleton of a horse picked clean by steppe scavengers, its bones arranged in a posture of running that seems to persist beyond the moment of death, and the sight stays with you as an emblem of the hardness of this life, the proximity of extinction that waits beneath the apparent emptiness of the landscape. The sound of Mongolian has begun, by the 6th week, to resolve into something closer to pattern, and you catch the repetition of certain sounds that mark greeting or farewell, the particular intonation that signals respect or command. The language will never become fully transparent to your understanding, yet the effort of listening itself becomes a kind of meditation, a discipline of attention that keeps you present in a world that might otherwise dissolve into mere strangeness. The first sight of Karakorum's walls after months of travel comes upon you gradually, the horizon developing a darkness that resolves, across the final day's approach, into the irregular line of a settlement that has grown beyond its original intentions. You are riding now in the company of Mongol escorts who have joined your party at the imperial relay stations, their presence marking your passage into territory where the authority of the Great Khan extends in direct lines rather than through the mediation of vassal princes. The walls appear first as a smudge against the southern sky, then as a definite interruption of the steppe's horizontal plane, and finally as a complex of mud, brick, and timber that encloses a space of surprising density. This arrival does not bring the emotional release that the European pilgrim experiences at Jerusalem, for the city lacks the architectural vocabulary of European expectation. Yet the sheer fact of arrival after 5,000 miles generates its own form of wonder, a quiet astonishment at the persistence of human movement across such distances. You pass through a gate where guards examine the tokens that your escorts present, their faces showing none of the curiosity that you have encountered in more remote territories, as if the traffic of strange peoples has become, at this center, too routine to occasion remark. The streets within the walls run in patterns that seem to follow no single principle of design, winding between quarters that your later acquaintance will identify as ethnically and religiously distinct. He described the division into ethnic and religious quarters, and you find yourself walking now through a district where the architecture and the dress of the inhabitants suggest Central Asian Muslim populations, then through another where the faces and garments carry the markers of Chinese craft workers, then through a third where the Christian symbol of the cross appears on a small structure that serves the Nestorian community. This division reflects the deliberate policy of the Mongol rulers, who gather skilled populations from across the empire and settle them in proximity to the imperial center, creating a city that is less a unified organism than a collection of fragments held in temporary suspension. The light in this latitude falls at angles that you have not learned to predict, the summer sun lingering late into the evening with a golden weight that seems to press the dust of the streets into visible suspension. You feel the particular dryness of the high plateau climate in the slight tightness of your skin, the way that moisture seems to leave the body without the intermediary of visible perspiration. A smith works at his forge in an open workshop, the sound of his hammer carrying a rhythm that seems to belong to metallurgy everywhere, yet the particular alloy that he shapes carries the properties of a metallurgical tradition that has traveled eastward from Persian centers of learning. The smell of hot metal mingles with the odors of cooking from a nearby establishment, the combination forming an atmosphere of settled habitation that contradicts the provisional character you had expected of this imperial foundation. The wait for an audience with Mengke Khan at the imperial camp occupies the days that follow your arrival, and you observe the procedures of the court with the attention that your Franciscan training in protocol has prepared you to exercise. The imperial camp lies at some distance from the city proper, a vast assemblage of tents and pavilions that possesses a mobility that the stone architecture of European courts would find incomprehensible, yet which maintains its hierarchical arrangements with a precision that any royal household would recognize. This delay teaches you the rhythm of Mongol governance, the way that power here flows through personal presence rather than through the mediating structures of written document and delegated authority. You watch the movement of officials between the city and the camp, the relay of messengers arriving from distant fronts of the ongoing Mongol campaigns, the gradual accumulation of personages whose dress and retinue indicate proximity to the center of decision. Your days pass in a lodging assigned to foreign arrivals, a space that you share with other envoys and travelers who have made their way to this imperial node from points as distant as your own Flanders. The cold of high-altitude nights, sleeping wrapped in felts, continues even here in the shadow of imperial power, for the Mongol elite maintain their nomadic practices of habitation even in the most formal circumstances. You wrap yourself in the felts provided and feel the gradual accumulation of your own warmth in the enclosed space, the way that the body learns to conserve its heat in conditions that would otherwise draw it outward into the dissipating air. The detailed observations of daily life recorded in his journal each evening become your own practice as the days of waiting accumulate into weeks. You sit in the fading light with your writing materials, the pen moving across the page with the automatic quality that develops when observation has become habitual. These entries preserve details that the memory would otherwise smooth into generality, the particular cut of a garment, the specific sequence of a commercial transaction, the exact wording of a phrase in the Mongolian that you struggle to transcribe in Latin characters. The taste of fermented mare's milk has given way in the city to a more varied diet, yet the beverage still appears at official functions, and you note its continued presence as a marker of Mongol identity that persists even in circumstance of apparent cosmopolitanism. The silver tree fountain at Mengke Khan's palace becomes visible to you only when the summons to audience finally arrives, and you are conducted through the outer precincts of the imperial camp toward the central pavilion where the Khan receives formal visitors. He noted this remarkable construction of precious metal, and you see it now as you approach, rising from a basin to spread branches from which, you will later learn, alcoholic beverages flow through concealed pipes to serve the entertainment of the court. The fountain represents the adaptation of Chinese artistic tradition to Mongol imperial display, and you observe it with the mixed response of a European who has been trained to regard such luxury with Franciscan suspicion, yet who cannot deny the technical accomplishment that it represents. It catches the light of lamps that have been lit against the gathering darkness, and the effect is of a tree that bears fruit of reflected illumination, each leaf and twig contributing to an overall impression of controlled abundance. The audience itself unfolds with a formality that you record in your journal that evening, the sequence of bowings and offerings, the translation of your Latin greeting into Mongolian through the mediation of interpreters who have learned their trade in the multilingual environment of the imperial camp. Mengke Khan receives you from a raised platform, his figure partially obscured by the arrangement of the space, his voice reaching you as a measured authority that requires no amplification. You present the letters of King Louis IX with the gestures that protocol demands, and you observe the Khan's response with the attention that your mission requires, searching his expression for indication of the favorable reception that your king has instructed you to secure. The days that follow the audience bring you into contact with the religious diversity that the Khan's policy of tolerance has gathered at his court. He witnessed religious debates sponsored by the Khan among Christians, Muslims, and Buddhists, and you find yourself present at one such occasion, seated among representatives of the Nestorian Christian community whose practice has developed in isolation from Roman authority across the centuries of Asian dispersion. These debates proceed with a format that seems designed less to establish truth than to demonstrate the range of available wisdom, the Khan himself presiding with an apparent neutrality that frustrates the missionary purpose that has brought you across 5,000 miles. You listen to the Buddhist Lama speak of cycles of rebirth and the accumulation of merit, to the Muslim scholar invoke the authority of the Prophet's revelation, to the Nestorian bishop argue for the unity of Christ's person, and you feel the frustration that will characterize your later report, the sense that these occasions serve the Khan's purpose of information, gathering rather than any genuine search for spiritual resolution. You walk the streets of Karakorum and confirm this assessment, noting that the population and the physical extent of the settlement do not match the European imagination of what an imperial capital should be. He found the city smaller than expected, given its imperial status, and you understand now the quality of observation that led to this conclusion, the way that the Mongol rulers have retained their nomadic scale of values even as they exercise dominion over the greatest territorial extent that history has yet witnessed. The endless horizon of grass merges with sky at the city's edge, and you feel the proximity of that open country even in the most densely inhabited quarters, as if the settlement were merely a temporary concentration of human energy that the steppe will gradually reclaim. The sound of guttural Mongolian spoken around unfamiliar consonants surrounds you in the marketplaces, where you go to observe the commercial life of the city, the exchange of goods that flows through Karakorum from every direction of the compass. You hear Chinese tones in one quarter, Persian melody in another, the Slavic cadences of captured artisans in a third, and you understand that the linguistic environment of this city represents a microcosm of the empire's vast extent. The taste of fermented mare's milk returns to you in certain establishments where the Mongol population maintains its dietary habits, and you accept the beverage with the familiarity that repetition has established, no longer remarking its strangeness, but noting instead the variations in preparation that distinguish one provider from another. He was frustrated by his failure to convert the Khan or secure an alliance against Islam, and you feel this frustration building across the months of your residence as the initial formality of reception gives way to the prolonged ambiguity of negotiation without resolution. The Khan's response to your king's proposals arrives in formulations that preserve all options, that commit to no definite course of military cooperation or religious recognition, and you understand gradually that the Mongol conception of diplomacy operates according to principles that your European training has not equipped you to manipulate. The distinctive smell of the steppe after rain comes to you one morning in early spring, as the ice breaks on the distant rivers and the herds begin to move towards summer pastures. You walk beyond the city walls to observe this seasonal transition, and the freshness of the moistened soil reaches you with an intensity that seems to carry all the months of your absence from European landscapes. He was among the first Europeans to study Mongol culture systematically, and the method of your observation has developed across the months into something approaching the systematic, the daily recording of custom and belief that will form the substance of your later report. His written account provides the most detailed description of Karakorum from this period, and you feel the responsibility of this uniqueness even as you write, the sense that your pen is tracing contours that no other European hand has attempted to capture. The final departure eastward, turning toward the return journey, comes in the spring of 1255, after nearly 2 years of residence in the Mongol territories. You arrange your journals and specimens with the care of a man who understands that these materials will constitute the lasting product of his journey, the tangible residue of experience that cannot be fully communicated through narrative alone. This departure carries you first toward the eastern extremity of the Mongol domains, where you hope to make contact with other Christian communities that rumor has placed in the farthest Asian reaches, and then, when this hope proves illusory, back toward the Western world that formed you. The endless horizon of grass merges with sky once more as you leave Karakorum behind, and you feel the peculiar emotion of departure from a place that has never become home, yet which has marked your consciousness with impressions that will persist for the remainder of your life. He returned to Europe in 1255 with his detailed report, and the journey of return retraces the vast distances that you crossed in your outward passage, yet with a difference of orientation that transforms even familiar landscapes into scenes of leave-taking rather than approach. The taste of fermented mare's milk returns with each stage of the westward movement, a continuity of experience that measures the journey in sensory repetition, even as the place names shift from Mongol to Turkic, to Persian, to the linguistic territory of your own origins. The sound of guttural Mongolian gradually diminishes in frequency, replaced by the more familiar sounds of Turkic dialects, then by the Mediterranean languages of the Crusader ports, where you eventually regain the sea route to Europe. The cold of high-altitude nights, sleeping wrapped in felt, persists through the mountain passages of the return, and you feel your body gradually relearning the expectations of European climate, the heavier air, the more predictable rhythms of seasonal change. The distinctive smell of the steppe after rain becomes, as you move westward, a memory rather than a present experience, and you find yourself searching for it in landscapes that offer analogous but not identical sensations, the rain scent of Italian valleys or the moistened dust of Provençal roads. He died around 1293, having returned from his eastern journey, and the years that remain to you after your return will be devoted to the ordering and presentation of your experience, the compilation of your journals into the coherent narrative that will influence European understanding of Asia for centuries. His account remained influential for European understanding of Asia for centuries, and you feel, in the closing of your own manuscript, the weight of this inheritance, the knowledge that your observations will outlast the particular circumstances of their making, and enter the longer currents of human curiosity about the world beyond the familiar horizon. You are standing at the entrance to the great feast hall at Karakorum, as afternoon light filters through high windows of oiled parchment. Around you, the air carries the sour tang of fermented mare's milk, already being poured in preparation for the evening's gathering. The cold air moves across your face from the outer corridors, but within this space, the warmth of a crowded feast hall in winter begins to accumulate against the stone walls. Servants pass with armloads of felt and silk to cushion the benches where guests will soon recline. The continuity of nomadic foodways persists even in this permanent capital, and you can smell the smoke of horse-dung fires that will cook the evening meal. The palace kitchens occupy a vast compound behind the feast hall, where preparations have been underway since before dawn. You are walking now through the outer passages, and around you, merchants unload cargoes of spices and fuel. The cold air moves across your face once more as you pass beneath an archway into the steam-filled spaces where cooking fires burn without rest. Whole sheep hang from wooden frames, their fat already beginning to render in the heat. The smell of roasting mutton fat dripping into fire mingles with the sharper scent of fermented milk being strained through cloth. Cooks in leather aprons move between stations, turning spits and checking the progress of boiled joints in enormous bronze cauldrons. The Mongol diet centered on the products of pastoral nomadism, especially horse and sheep, and this evening's meal will demonstrate that centrality with unmistakable clarity. The light here is amber and shifting, thrown by flames rather than sun, and it catches the edges of cooking knives and the sweat on broad foreheads. You are standing at the threshold between kitchen and preparation hall, and around you, wooden platters are being arranged for service. The steam rising from boiled meat drifts in visible clouds toward the ceiling vents. Mare's milk, fermented as Koumiss or Eyedei, was a staple beverage with mild alcoholic content, and you observe the great leather bags being carried toward the feast hall, their contents sloshing with each step. The cold air moves across your face in sudden drafts as doors open and close, carrying the promise of the evening's abundance to those who wait beyond. You are moving now through corridors where the arrival of guests from across the empire, each in distinctive dress, has begun to transform the antechambers into exhibitions of imperial reach. Around you, ceremonial garments are unfolded from bundles. A Persian ambassador adjusts the folds of his brocade robe, its threads catching the lamplight in threads of silver and midnight blue. The visual richness of silk robes and gold vessels surrounds you as Tibetan monks in saffron wool converse, with Chinese officials whose silk sleeves brush the floor. A Russian prince stands apart, his fur-trimmed hat marking his northern origin, while a Korean envoy bows deeply to a man from Baghdad, whose turban wraps layer upon layer of fine cotton. The cold air moves across your face from the entrance where more guests still arrive, their breath visible in the corridor before they pass into the warmed interior. The warmth of a crowded feast hall in winter intensifies as you enter the main space, and around you, political intention mingles with physical presence. The feast hall at Karakorum could accommodate large numbers of guests and ambassadors, and this evening it will fulfill that capacity. You are standing near the eastern wall, observing the precise arrangement of benches and low tables that radiate from the central dais. Seating arrangements at banquets reflected precise hierarchies of status, and you note how each position has been calculated with the exactitude of a military campaign. The Khan's person was protected by ceremonial barriers, no one approaching unbidden, and a space of several arm lengths separates his elevated platform from the nearest guest. Guards in lacquered armor stand at intervals, their faces impassive beneath iron helmets. The sour tang of fermented mare's milk on the tongue will soon be familiar to every throat in this hall, though for now the first pouring from the silver tree awaits the proper moment. You are standing where you can observe the mechanism, and around you, anticipation gathers in the murmur of assembled guests. The silver tree fountain dispensed alcoholic beverages at court banquets, an engineering marvel that travelers had described in wonder. Crafted by a Parisian goldsmith brought to Karakorum, the tree stands at the hall's center, its trunk and branches formed of gleaming metal, its roots spreading across a basin that catches what flows. The cold air moves across your face from hidden bellows that will soon drive the liquid through concealed pipes, sending fermented drinks cascading from the mouths of metal serpents coiled among the leaves. The light shifts as attendants add oil to the lamps, and the visual richness of silk robes and gold vessels intensifies in the multiplied flames. You are standing at your appointed place, and around you, protocol and precedence govern every gesture. The sound of throat singing and stringed instruments between toasts begins from a corner where musicians have arranged themselves on cushions of pressed felt. The Morin Kua, its horsehead carving catching the light, sends a low drone beneath the higher notes of a bowed Igil. The warmth of a crowded feast hall in winter presses against your skin through layers of travel-worn clothing, and you feel the particular density of a space filled with bodies and expectation. The ritual toasts to the Khan's health, each guest drinking in turn, commence with the arrival of the great man himself. You are standing as all stand, and around you, deference and observation merge in the single movement of bending forms. The Khan enters through a concealed door, his figure broad and deliberate in robes of imperial yellow, and the assembly bends as one. Toasts and ceremonial drinking were governed by elaborate protocol, and you watch as the first cup is raised by a senior minister, its contents dedicated to the ruler's longevity and fortune. The cold air moves across your face from the motion of your own arm as you raise the vessel and drink, the liquid spreading its particular warmth through your chest. The feast was a political institution, cementing alliances and displaying submission, and you observe how each ambassador's response to the toast is measured and noted by unseen observers. You are standing among those who have traveled farthest, and around you, measured words and careful sips establish the evening's diplomatic texture. A second toast follows, then a third, each with its prescribed formula and its specific recipient among the assembled dignitaries. The steam rising from boiled meat on wooden platters begins to reach your position as servants circulate with the first course. The smell of roasting mutton fat dripping into fire lingers in your clothing from the kitchens, but here it merges with the immediate presence of food prepared for consumption. The serving of roasted meat in large joints, carved at table, proceeds with the same ceremonial gravity that governed the toasts. You are standing now at a position where you can observe the process, and around you, knives and skewers are prepared for the work of division. A whole roasted sheep is brought forward on a wooden frame, its skin crackled and darkened, its interior yielding to the pressure of a long blade. A portion is laid before you on a wooden platter, its surface glistening with rendered fat, and you note how the meat's texture yields to a sharp knife's edge. The warmth of a crowded feast hall in winter has grown substantial now, layered with the heat of bodies and fires, and the exhalations of consumed drink. You are standing in a space transformed by accumulation, and around you, reserve begins to loosen in the rising frequency of unguarded gestures. The visual richness of silk robes and gold vessels appears in softer focus as lamp oil consumes itself and flames settle lower. Foreign guests often found the fermented milk products unfamiliar and potent, and you observe a European visitor beside you, his face registering the particular challenge of Koumiss to an unaccustomed palate. The gradual easing of formality as the evening progresses and cups are refilled manifests in the gradual rearrangement of bodies and voices. You are standing less rigidly now, and around you, conversation and comparison flow across previous boundaries of language and rank. A Tibetan Lama speaks with a Chinese scholar about the qualities of tea versus fermented milk, their gestures becoming more expansive as cups circulate. The cold air moves across your face in occasional refreshing drafts from the ventilation shafts, but the warmth of a crowded feast hall in winter maintains its dominance. The great Khans held feasts as demonstrations of wealth and power, and this evening's progression illustrates that purpose through cumulative sensory experience. You are standing where you can observe the silver tree fountain in renewed operation, and around you, renewed thirst draws guests toward its mechanical dispensation. The first pouring from the silver tree has given way to repeated dispensations, and servants now operate the mechanism with the efficiency of long practice. The smell of roasting mutton fat dripping into fire persists, as additional joints are brought from the kitchens to replace consumed portions. The steam rising from boiled meat on wooden platters continues to rise in fresh waves, and you note how the feast hall at Karakorum maintains its purpose through sustained abundance. The consumption of meat and dairy products varied seasonally with herd movements, but here in the permanent capital, the storage of preserved provisions allows the simulation of summer plenty in winter's depth. You are standing near a group discussing the sources of the evening's provisions, and around you, dried strips and hardened curds supplement the fresh preparations. Dried meat and curdled milk products were preserved for winter consumption, and you observe the presentation of these preserved foods alongside the fresh, a dual demonstration of nomadic adaptability and imperial resource. The cold air moves across your face from a servant passing with a tray of hardened arul, the dried curds clicking against each other like stones. You are standing where the acoustics carry this transformation clearly, and around you, vigilance relaxes in the softening of postures and the lowering of guarded expressions. A singer produces the characteristic overtones that seem to originate from multiple throats, the low fundamental note sustained, while higher harmonics trace melodic patterns above. The visual richness of silk robes and gold vessels now includes loosened sashes and set-aside head coverings, the accumulated heat demanding some relief from formal constraint. Fresh horse blood was consumed for nutrition during long campaigns, though this evening's feast does not require such desperate measures. You are standing where such knowledge informs your observation without demanding explicit acknowledgement, and around you, unspoken comparisons pass between those familiar with different culinary traditions. The meat was typically boiled or roasted over open fires, and the methods of preparation visible in this hall represent the elevation of necessity to ceremony. The cold air moves across your face from a brief opening of the service entrance, and you glimpse the continued activity of the kitchens beyond, where preparations for subsequent courses proceed without pause. The continuity of nomadic foodways persisted even in the permanent capital, and you observe how the feast structure mirrors patterns that would obtain in a jur on the open steppe. You are standing at a point of cultural translation, and around you, recognition and adjustment pass in the exchange of knowing glances between those who share pastoral origins. The circular arrangement of guests, the precedence given to certain positions relative to the door, the communal consumption from shared vessels, all these elements persist from portable origins. You are standing where you can observe this relaxation without participating in its excesses, and around you, diminished inhibition allows gestures that would have been unthinkable hours before. A junior ambassador from some Western principality raises his cup unbidden, and the lapse passes without censure in the general softening of attention. The steam rising from boiled meat on wooden platters has diminished as the initial hunger of the assembly finds satisfaction, though servants continue to circulate with additional offerings. The smell of roasting mutton fat dripping into fire now carries the slightly charred note of long-continued cooking. You are standing where the press of bodies has increased, and around you, late arrival and opportune presence thicken the already dense atmosphere. The visual richness of silk robes and gold vessels includes now the occasional flash of armor beneath cloaks, guards maintaining their stations despite the general relaxation. You are standing where you can observe the mechanism's operation in detail, and around you, technical curiosity draws observers to its mechanical ingenuity. A servant operates the concealed bellows, and you note how the pressure forces liquid through the metal trunk to emerge from the mouths of serpents and the cups of leaves. You are standing where you can observe the dais from a respectful distance, and around you, calculated approach governs the movements of those who seek private audience. A senior minister has ascended to speak privately with the ruler, their heads inclined together in conference that the assembly pretends not to observe. The cold air moves across your face from another ventilation shaft, and you welcome its moderating influence. You are standing where the consequences of such enactment will eventually reach you, and around you, future obligation and understood debt establish themselves in the unspoken calculations of departing guests. A Russian prince has been summoned to approach the dais. His progress through the crowd watched with the particular attention accorded to visible demonstrations of favor or displeasure. You are standing where a servant offers you additional portion, and around you, polite refusal and concealed satiation govern the responses of those who have consumed sufficient. Your own platter retains evidence of adequate consumption, the bones arranged in the pattern that signals completion without insult to the host's generosity. The steam rising from boiled meat on wooden platters reaches you less frequently now, the circulation of fresh preparations having slowed with recognized satisfaction. You are standing where conversation has become possible across previous boundaries of language and rank, and around you, attempted communication and partial understanding establish temporary connections between strangers. A Persian merchant gestures toward your European features with the curiosity that months of alterity have established as habitual, his questions about distant kingdoms emerging through the translation of shared cups and common food. You are standing in the aftermath of that demonstration, and around you, digestive pause and reflective stillness replace the earlier intensity of consumption and performance. The cold air moves across your face from the increasingly frequent opening of doors as guests begin the gradual process of departure. You are standing in the relative quiet of a space still populated, but no longer collectively focused, and around you, individual departure and separate purpose disperse the evening's temporary community. The warmth of a crowded feast hall in winter begins to feel less oppressive as bodies diminish in number, their heat no longer cumulative. The continuity of nomadic foodways persists even in the permanent capital, and you carry with you the proof of that persistence in the lingering taste of fermented milk and the memory of meat's particular preparation. You are standing at the threshold between the feast hall and the outer corridors, and around you, departure and return mark the transition from collective to individual experience. The cold air moves across your face with renewed intensity as you pass beyond the heated interior, and you feel the particular shock of temperature transition that marks the boundary between ceremonial and ordinary space. You are walking now through corridors where servants begin the work of restoration, and around you, soiled linens and emptied vessels accumulate for subsequent attention. The visual richness of silk robes and gold vessels diminishes as guests disperse to their respective quarters, the display having served its temporary purpose. You are standing where you must choose between continued participation and the withdrawal that rest requires, and around you, similar decisions determine the movements of those who share your fatigue. The smell of roasting mutton fat dripping into fire has faded from your immediate perception, though it will remain in your garments until laundering permits its removal. The cold air moves across your face from the passage toward your assigned quarters, and you follow its guidance towards sleep and the eventual integration of this experience into the larger narrative of your eastern journey. You are standing at the door of your chamber, and around you, final preparation for rest concludes the evening's sequence of ceremonial actions. The cold air moves across your face from the ventilation gap above the door, and you welcome its presence as counterbalance to the heat of digestion and mental processing. You are lying in the darkness of your chamber, and around you, The night sounds of Karakorum proceed with their own rhythms independent of palace ceremony. The cold air moves across your face in the steady pattern that precedes sleep, and you feel the particular heaviness of a body that has been well fed and moderately intoxicated in the company of strangers whose languages you barely comprehend. You are lying in the approach to sleep, and around you the merchants are unloading their cargoes of dream and dissolution. The visual richness of silk robes and gold vessels persists as afterimage, the mind's retention of sensory intensity that exceeded ordinary experience. The steam rising from boiled meat on wooden platters, the smell of roasting mutton fat dripping into fire, the sound of throat singing and stringed instruments between toasts. All these elements merge in the half-conscious processing that precedes the deeper organization of memory into narrative form. You are lying in the darkness where sleep approaches, and around you the merchants are unloading their cargoes of oblivion and restoration. The cold air moves across your face with the gentle insistence of steppe wind finding passage through stone construction, and you follow its guidance toward the unconsciousness that will prepare you for subsequent days of travel and observation. The morning air carries the particular sharpness of the Mongolian plateau as you stand at the outer gates of Karakorum, the city that serves as the beating heart of the largest contiguous territory in history. Around you, the embassy quarter has begun its daily rhythm of preparation and anticipation, with servants carrying water and kindling between the low buildings of rammed earth and timber. The sky above stretches in an unbroken pale blue, unmarked by cloud, and the distant mountains present themselves as a faint suggestion of violet against the horizon. You are observing the arrival of a Song Chinese embassy, their procession having entered the city in the hour before dawn. The silk robes of the lead ambassadors shimmer with a quality that distinguishes them immediately from the rougher woolen garments of the steppe peoples. Porcelain vessels, wrapped in layers of padded cloth, are being lifted carefully from the backs of pack animals and set upon wooden trestles for inspection. The weight of diplomatic gifts being unwrapped and displayed creates a solemn choreography of gloved hands and murmured assessments. Each piece of celadon catches the morning light in its translucent glaze, and the particular silence before being summoned to the Khan's presence seems to settle already upon the shoulders of these southern envoys. The competing accents of a dozen languages in the embassy quarter accompany every transaction and greeting. A steward in a conical hat marks the inventory with brush and ink, while interpreters move between the groups with the practiced patience of men who have learned that meaning must often be negotiated as carefully as any commodity. You notice how the Chinese delegation maintains a formal spacing between its members, each rank precisely observed, while around them the general movement of the camp follows looser patterns of proximity and familiarity. The smell of unfamiliar spices from distant kitchens drifts across from the cooking fires established for the various embassies, each group maintaining its own dietary customs, even in this place of convergence. Saffron and cardamom announce the presence of the Muslim merchants, while the Chinese contingent has brought its own cooks and the particular aromatics of fermented bean paste and rice wine. The cold patience of hours waiting in antechambers is already becoming familiar to these travelers, who have spent months in transit and have learned that haste signifies neither importance nor wisdom in the Mongol court. The main Silk Road route ran from Chang'an over 400 kilometers to the Levant, and those who have completed even a portion of that journey carry themselves with a certain gravity of accomplishment. You are standing now near the trestle where the porcelain is displayed, and a young member of the Chinese retinue explains in halting Turkic that these pieces were fired in the kilns of Longquan under the supervision of craftsmen who have devoted their lives to the perfection of Celadon. The visual variety of costumes grows more pronounced as the morning advances and the other embassies make their appearances. Chinese silk robes, Arab turbans, European friar's habit, each arriving group adding its distinctive textile to the assembly. A Rus prince's delegation bearing furs from the northern forests enters through the western gate as the sun clears the low buildings. Sable and ermine, still supple with their winter density, are presented for examination in bundles that required months of trapping and preparation in the darkness of the boreal woodlands. The presence of these northern pelts alongside the southern porcelain demonstrates the geographical logic that governs this assembly. You move closer to observe the handling of the furs, noting how the Mongol inspectors press their fingers into the thickness of the pelt to assess its quality and age. The particular silence before being summoned to the Khan's presence settles again as the Rus delegation completes its initial presentation and awaits the pleasure of the court. Their leader, a boyar with beard still bearing the frost marks of his journey, stands with the immobility of a man who has learned that display of impatience serves no purpose in this setting. Around him, his younger attendants struggle to maintain equivalent composure, their eyes moving across the unfamiliar scene with the hunger of those who have never before traveled beyond the forest zone. The competing accents of a dozen languages in the embassy quarter rise and fall with the arrival of each new party. You find yourself positioned near a group of interpreters who are comparing notes on the various dialects of Persian and Turkic that circulate through the camp. Their conversation, a private seminar in the practical linguistics of empire. A smell of unfamiliar spices from distant kitchens intensifies as the midday meal approaches, and you observe how the different embassies maintain careful separation even in the act of eating, each group turned inward toward its own customs and its own memories of home. The Silk Road reached its greatest security under unified Mongol rule in the late 13th century, and this security manifests in the confidence with which valuable cargoes are displayed in the open air. Few merchants traveled the entire route. Goods moved through intermediate handlers, and the porcelain before you has likely passed through the hands of Sogdian or Ica traders before reaching its current destination. The weight of diplomatic gifts being unwrapped and displayed serves purposes beyond the material, each object functioning as a statement of cultural capacity and political intention. You are standing at the edge of the main thoroughfare when Muslim merchants from Baghdad, with spices and gemstones, arrive from the south. Their caravan has come through the passes of Afghanistan, and the dust of that journey still clings to the folds of their traveling robes. The visual variety of costumes receives its next variation in the flowing garments of these Mesopotamian traders, whose head coverings speak of cities and climates far removed from the steppe. Lapis lazuli from the mines of Badakhshan, which the main Silk Road route passed through after crossing the Pamir Mountains, gleams in the morning light as the chests are opened for inspection. The cold patience of hours waiting in antechambers is a discipline these merchants have mastered through long experience in the courts of multiple rulers. You observe how they arrange themselves with the unconscious geometry of those accustomed to public spaces, maintaining conversational distance while preserving the possibility of private consultation. Greetings pass through chains of interpretation, each translation adding its own slight distortion and correction to the circuit of meaning. The smell of unfamiliar spices from distant kitchens now includes the sharp sweetness of the cardamom these men have brought, and you notice how the Mongol stewards mark the provenance of each item with a system of tags and notations that will permit accurate accounting to the central administration. The Mongol policy of religious tolerance facilitated merchant activity across cultural boundaries, and you observe its practical expression in the unobtrusive presence of multiple prayer rugs and portable altars among the baggage of the various embassies. No single ritual dominates the public space, and the absence of enforced uniformity creates an atmosphere of watchful coexistence in which commerce can proceed without the friction of confessional competition. The weight of diplomatic gifts being unwrapped and displayed includes objects intended for religious as well as secular appreciation, and the Mongol inspectors handle Christian reliquaries and Buddhist scriptures with equivalent procedural neutrality. The entrance of William of Rubruck as the representative of Latin Christendom occurs in the early afternoon, when the light has shifted to a lower angle and the shadows of the embassy quarter have lengthened across the packed earth. You are positioned near the central assembly point when the Franciscan friar appears, his European habit marking him as immediately distinctive among the other costumes, as the Chinese silk had marked its wearers in the morning. The visual variety of costumes achieves its full assembly in this moment, and you observe how the various groups adjust their attention to acknowledge this newest arrival. You move to observe his initial reception, noting how the Mongol officials study his appearance with the same evaluative attention they have applied to the furs and gemstones. The cold patience of hours waiting in antechambers will be tested in his case by the absence of familiar languages among the court interpreters, and you watch as preliminary efforts at communication proceed through a chain of Latin to French to Arabic to Persian to Mongol, each link adding its delay and potential for misunderstanding. Rubruck speaks with the measured deliberation of a man who understands that his words will travel through multiple transformations before reaching their intended recipient, and his initial statements of greeting and intention are crafted with a simplicity that acknowledges the hazards of translation. The smell of unfamiliar spices from distant kitchens has begun to mingle with the sharper scent of the friar's unwashed wool, the olfactory signature of a journey that has passed through the same territories of Central Asia that tested the endurance of the Chinese and Baghdad merchants. The convergence of envoys at Karakorum represented an unprecedented gathering of Eurasian powers, and you are witnessing the daily texture of that convergence in the movements and negotiations of this single afternoon. The weight of diplomatic gifts being unwrapped and displayed now includes the modest offerings of the Franciscan mission, whose religious character precluded the accumulation of wealth that financed the other embassies. Rubruck presents a letter from King Louis IX of France, its seals and formulae intended to establish equivalence between distant monarchs who have never corresponded directly. The Mongol officials receive this document with the same procedural care they have applied to the inventories of goods, and you observe how the absence of material magnificence in the Christian offering is compensated by an elaboration of ceremonial gesture. The careful observation of protocol as each ambassador awaited audience governs the movements of the entire afternoon. You are standing now at the perimeter of the central waiting area, where the various embassies have arranged themselves in a pattern that reflects both their order of arrival and their assessed importance in the Mongol calculus of power. The Chinese maintain their position of precedence. The Rus delegation occupies a middle ground of territorial proximity. The Baghdad merchants hold their place through the sheer value of their commodities, and Rubruck finds himself positioned at the edge of this configuration, his status still under negotiation. The cold patience of hours waiting in antechambers manifests differently in each national style. The Chinese ambassadors maintain a formal stillness that approaches meditation, their silk robes settling into folds that suggest both comfort and immobility. The Ruse Boyar paces with the restrained energy of a man accustomed to outdoor command, his boots stirring the dust in measured intervals. The Baghdad merchants engage in quiet commerce among themselves, the exchange of small goods and information continuing even in this interval of official suspension. Rubruck kneels in prayer, his lips moving with the private discipline of a man who has learned to maintain interior focus against the distraction of unfamiliar surroundings. You observe how the various groups respond to this intensification of expectation, some becoming more still, others engaging in sudden bursts of low conversation that seem to discharge accumulated tension. The smell of unfamiliar spices from distant kitchens returns with renewed intensity as the evening fires are kindled, and you notice how the waiting ambassadors accept the offer of food and drink that circulates among them. The visual variety of costumes is softened by the gathering darkness, the distinctions of color and texture becoming less pronounced as the light fails. The weight of diplomatic gifts being unwrapped and displayed has given way to the weight of bodies settling into the postures of endurance, each embassy maintaining its separate cluster against the advancing night. The informal exchanges of information in the waiting periods between audiences constitute a parallel diplomacy that operates beneath the surface of formal proceedings. You are positioned near a group of interpreters who have established a temporary camaraderie across their usual divisions, and you attend to their conversation with the unobtrusive attention that permits observation without intrusion. They speak of road conditions and bandit activity, of the health of particular rulers and the reliability of particular routes, the intelligence of the road exchanged with the same readiness as the goods that move along it. Marco Polo traveled the route to China in this period of Mongol dominance, and though he has not yet arrived at this particular gathering, the conditions that will make his journey possible are visible in the security that surrounds these present embassies. That security expresses itself in the confidence with which strangers speak to strangers in this waiting area, in the absence of armed tension that would characterize equivalent gatherings in less pacified territories. You find yourself identifying speakers by voice rather than appearance, and the temporary blindness imposed by night creates a curious democracy of attention in which the European Latin and the Chinese tones receive equivalent concentration. The cold patience of hours waiting in antechambers transforms into something more like companionship as the various groups draw closer around shared fires, the physical necessity of warmth overriding the ceremonial maintenance of distance. The smell of unfamiliar spices from distant kitchens mingles now with the sharper scent of animal dung burning as fuel, the olfactory signature of the steppe asserting itself against the imported aromatics of the civilizations that have converged here. You are standing at the edge of the largest fire, and the heat moves across your face in pulses that correspond to the shifting of the breeze. They converse in a mixture of Arabic and gesture, and the content of their exchange seems to concern the geography of the lands that lie between Karakorum and the Mediterranean coast, from which goods continued by sea to European markets. The Friar's questions reveal the cartographic ambition that underlies his spiritual mission, and the Armenian's answers demonstrate the accumulated knowledge of those who have made their livelihood in the movement between East and West. You notice how the Chinese ambassadors unfold small screens of polished wood to protect their faces from the direct heat, maintaining a physical reserve even in this informal setting. The Ruse Boyar has produced a flask of some distilled spirit from the northern forests, and its passage among the group creates temporary bonds of obligation that transcend the usual boundaries of language and faith. The visual variety of costumes achieves a final transformation in the firelight, the distinctions of origin becoming less significant than the shared posture of those who have come to this place from distances that few of their countrymen will ever traverse. You are seated now among the outer circle of observers, and the warmth of the fire has begun to work upon your own limbs the same relaxation that you observe in the travelers around you. A Muslim merchant explains the proper grading of saffron to a Chinese steward, their exchange conducted in a trade Persian that both have acquired for exactly this purpose. The Rus boyar listens with apparent comprehension to a discussion of steppe politics conducted in the Turkic dialect that serves as the nearest approach to a lingua franca in this assembly. Rubruck and his Armenian interpreter continue their geographical consultation, the friar's hand moving in the air to trace imagined routes and boundaries. You observe how the various groups withdraw to their separate quarters, the temporary community of the fire dissolving back into the formal structures of embassy identity. The cold patience of hours waiting in antechambers will resume with the dawn, but for these remaining hours the travellers surrender to the horizontal relief of sleep, their bodies arranged in patterns that reflect both individual habit and national custom. The smell of unfamiliar spices from distant kitchens lingers in the air as you move through the quieted camp, the particular silence before being summoned to the Khan's presence, now generalized across the entire quarter in the silence of exhausted sleep. Those who have completed even portions of that 6,000-kilometer route carry in their bodies a knowledge of distance that no map can fully represent. You are standing now at the edge of the camp, looking outward toward the darkness of the steppe that surrounds this island of temporary gathering. Post stations were established along major routes to facilitate communication, and the system that permitted this gathering will continue to function after its participants have dispersed, the infrastructure of empire outlasting the particular occasions of its use. The visual variety of costumes will be remembered and described in reports that travel by other routes than their wearers, the representation of diversity becoming itself a commodity of information. The weight of diplomatic gifts being unwrapped and displayed will be translated into lists and valuations, the material substance of exchange converted into the abstract registers of account. You are moving now toward your own place of rest, and the cold air moves across your face with the particular quality of the high plateau night, carrying with it the distant suggestion of weather that has traveled from ranges beyond the immediate horizon. The smell of unfamiliar spices from distant kitchens has been replaced by the simpler scent of burning dung cooling in the fire pits, the domesticated residue of the day's sociability. You are lying now in the darkness, and the accumulated impressions of this day of observation gradually dissolve into the larger pattern of your journey, the particular details of Karakorum merging with the broader understanding of how the largest contiguous territory in history maintained its coherence through the movement of persons and goods and information across distances that would have defeated any less systematic arrangement of power. You are sinking now into the particular silence that precedes not the Khan's presence, but the deeper presence of sleep, and the last impressions that move across your consciousness include the memory of firelight on unfamiliar faces, the distant sound of a horse moving in the darkness, and the gradual recognition that the security which makes all this possible is itself the most precious and the most fragile of all the commodities that have converged upon this place. The hollow sound of wind in emptying courtyards reaches you first, before any human voice disturbs the morning. You are standing in the outer precinct of Karakorum in the year 1259, and the cold air moves across your face with the particular sharpness that announces the steppe winter's approach. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes with less enthusiasm than in seasons past, their movements slower, their eyes turning more frequently toward the eastern horizon where news travels in fragments and rumors. The distant smoke of the new capital, far to the southeast, has not yet appeared in your field of vision, but already you sense its gravitational pull upon the affairs of this place. The stone walls that once marked a brief experiment in settled capital life now seem to hold the city in place by force of habit, rather than by the urgency of imperial purpose. Mönch Khan has died in the humid valleys of Sichuan, and the Mongol Empire fragmented into successor khanates after his death. The news arrives in fragments carried by exhausted horses, each rider more breathless than the last, each version of events slightly more elaborate than the one preceding it. You watch a group of officials gather near the silver tree, that mechanical wonder fashioned by the Parisian goldsmith Guillaume Boucher, and their gestures suggest the uncertainty of men who have lost the axis around which their world revolved. The tree itself still stands in the great hall, its four serpents still poised to deliver wine and fermented mare's milk into the waiting cups of absent guests. But the workshops around it have begun to fall silent, one by one, as the craftsmen sense the coming dispersal. The silence where Boucher's forge once rang is not yet absolute, but you can detect in the quality of the remaining sounds the first intimations of an ending. The enduring cold of the steppe winter settles into your bones as you move through streets where the first spring grass has not yet had opportunity to grow between stones left untended. Kublai Khan, born on 23 September 1215, and brother of Mönch, waits in his northern Chinese territories, and the distance between his power base and this Mongol heartland measures more than mere geography. You pass a group of soldiers whose armor catches the pale light, and their conversation ceases as you draw near, not from suspicion, but from the shared bewilderment of a community whose central narrative has suddenly lost its coherence. The creak of cart wheels bearing archives and treasures eastward has not yet begun in earnest, but in the warehouses you can see the preliminary sorting, the careful decisions about what merits transport and what can be left to the mercies of time and abandonment. The first spring grass growing between stones in untended streets will come, but for now, the ground remains frozen in the patterns of its last purposeful use. You find yourself near the northern gate, where the road stretches toward the lands that Kublai has made his own, and the quality of light suggests a dawn that brings no particular renewal. Around you, the merchants unload their cargoes with the mechanical efficiency of men who have performed these actions so many times that the movements have become indistinguishable from ritual. Yet something in their posture suggests that the meaning of the ritual has begun to dissolve. Kublai became a significant Mongol ruler from 1260, and the succession struggle that follows Mönch's death will consume the better part of 4 years before his authority achieves recognition sufficient to sustain a new order. You are present in Karakorum during the months of uncertainty, when the city retains the shell of its former significance, while the substance drains away through channels invisible to casual observation. The stone walls and permanent structures that marked a brief experiment in settled capital life now frame scenes of hesitation and partial commitment, as officials calculate their allegiances with the precision of men whose survival depends upon correct prediction. The hollow sound of wind in emptying courtyards accompanies your movements through spaces that seem to expand in proportion to their diminishing population. Each room you enter larger than memory suggested, each corridor longer than the footsteps required to traverse it. Kublai was a grandson of Genghis Khan, and this lineage weighs upon him in ways that both authorize his ambition and constrain his choices, for the nomadic heritage persists in the imperial family's seasonal migrations, even from the new capital that he will eventually establish. You observe a council of elders whose deliberations extend through an afternoon and into the evening, their voices rising and falling in patterns that suggest not disagreement so much as the gradual recognition that the terms of their discourse have become inadequate to the situation they confront. The silence where Boucher's forge once rang now spreads to adjacent workshops, as the metalworkers and jewelers and textile makers follow the logic of their own economic survival toward the concentrations of power and patronage that promise continuation. The enduring cold of the steppe winter does not relent for human departure, and you feel this truth in the particular quality of stillness that settles over Karakorum in the hours before dawn. You stand near the silver tree in the great hall, and its metallic surfaces reflect the lamplight with a fidelity that seems almost reproachful, as if the object itself understands that the ceremonies it was built to serve will not survive the generation that commissioned it. Around you, the merchants unload their cargoes for what you suspect may be the final time, their transactions conducted with a haste that borders upon indifference, as if the goods themselves have lost the significance that once attached to their exchange. Karakorum retained symbolic significance, but declined in political importance after 1260, and you witness the precise mechanism of this decline in the daily diminishment of purposeful activity. The cold air moves across your face with a persistence that seems almost animate, as if the climate itself participates in the restoration of a natural order disturbed by the city's brief interruption. You pass the quarters where the Chinese craftsmen once lived in concentrations sufficient to support their own temples and kitchens and burial societies, and the emptiness of these spaces suggests not abandonment so much as the reversal of a tide whose advance had seemed, to those living within it, irreversible. Kublai moved the Mongol capital from Karakorum to Khanbaliq, and this move represented not merely administrative convenience, but the increasing Sinicization of Mongol rule, the gradual acceptance that the empire's future lay in the agricultural south rather than in the pastoral heartland of its origins. You observe the remaining population returning to pastoral life around the walls, their tents appearing in growing numbers in the spaces between the stone structures, as if the city were being digested by the very mode of existence it had briefly supplanted. The hollow sound of wind in emptying courtyards has become the dominant acoustic experience of your days, and you find yourself listening for variations in its quality as others might attend to music. The silence where Boucher's forge once rang extends now to the entire industrial quarter, and the absence of hammer upon anvil produces in you a strange sensation of temporal dislocation, as if you have been transported to a period before the city's foundation rather than one after its decline. The enduring cold of the steppe winter wraps itself around the remaining structures with a patience that suggests geological rather than historical time, and you understand that the walls which seemed so permanent were, from the perspective of the land itself, merely a temporary arrangement of materials. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, though the harbour here is merely a river crossing where the flat-bottomed boats load the accumulated records of Mongol administration for transport to their new repository. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the particular moisture that precedes snowfall, and around you the merchants unload their cargoes with the finality of men who recognize that their function in this place has reached its terminus. Kublai founded the Yuan dynasty in 1271, and this formal establishment of a new order ratifies what the movement of peoples and objects has already accomplished in practice. You observe the final symbolic moment when the imperial seal moved to Khanbaliq, though the moment itself unfolds without the ceremony that its significance might seem to warrant, merely a careful packing, a supervised loading, a departure at dawn, when the light is insufficient to distinguish the expressions of those who witness it. The Yuan dynasty ruled China from 1279 to 1368, the first foreign dynasty to conquer all China, and this accomplishment, still decades in the future from your present vantage, casts its shadow backward upon the decisions you witness. You walk through the great hall where the silver tree still stands, though its mechanisms have ceased to function, and the silence where Boucher's forge once rang seems to have expanded to encompass the entire structure, a silence so complete that your own footsteps upon the wooden floor assume the quality of intrusion. The hollow sound of wind in emptying courtyards follows you through spaces that have lost their capacity to generate meaning, and you find yourself inventing narratives for rooms whose actual histories have already escaped recollection. The enduring cold of the steppe, winter, settles into the intervals between your observations, a ground against which all particular events emerge, and into which they subsequently dissolve. Around you, the merchants unload their cargoes in patterns so reduced from former abundance that the activity itself seems to participate in the general diminishment, each transaction a diminished echo of transactions that once sustained a more elaborate social fabric. The cold air moves across your face as you emerge into the open, and the sky above Karakorum displays the particular clarity that comes with altitude and with the absence of smoke from concentrated human habitation. The remaining population returning to pastoral life around the walls has established patterns of movement that circumvent rather than engage with the city's former centers, and you follow these patterns in your own wandering, discovering in the process how quickly the steppe reasserts its claims upon spaces that human ambition temporarily cleared and structured. Kublai, who died on 18 February 1294 in Beijing, will not live to see the full flowering of the order he establishes, nor its eventual dissolution, but the direction of his life's work is already apparent in the gravitational pull that draws the empire's substance toward the eastern capital. You stand in the outer precinct where you once stood, and the comparison between your present sensation and your memory of that earlier moment yields a measure of the transformation that has occurred, not merely in the city's physical condition, but in the quality of attention that you bring to your observations. The silence where Boucher's forge once rang has become absolute now, and in this absolute you detect not merely the cessation of a particular activity, but the conclusion of an entire mode of existence that the forge had represented. The enduring cold of the steppe winter continues its governance of the climate, unchanged by human departure, and you wrap yourself in furs as you move through spaces that have lost their interior warmth along with their populations. Around you, the merchants unload their cargoes in numbers so reduced that the term seems to overstate the commercial significance of their activities, their exchanges more akin to barter among survivors than to the transactions that once sustained an imperial capital. The Yuan rulers governed China, with Mongols dominating key military and administrative posts, and while the formal ethnic hierarchy was not yet fully codified, emerging social arrangements already reflected this principle of Mongol political supremacy. The Chinese were reportedly prohibited from bearing arms and from intermarriage with Mongols, and these prohibitions, when they appear in surviving records, may represent not innovation, but codification of distinctions that Mongol expansion had already rendered customary. The cold air moves across your face as you watch a group of families dismantle their tent and load their possessions upon carts, their destination unspecified, their departure contributing to the gradual evacuation that will leave Karakorum a site of memory rather than of residence. Agricultural land appears to have been confiscated for Mongol nobles and military garrisons in territories under Kublai's control. And this pattern of land tenure, which may have extended to the former capital region, likely contributed to the departure of Chinese agriculturalists whose labor had briefly supplemented the pastoral economy. You stand in the great hall where the silver tree still stands, though its surfaces have dulled with the accumulation of dust and the cessation of polishing, and the silence where Boucher's forge once rang seems to have achieved a permanence that no future activity will disturb. The enduring cold of the steppe winter wraps the structure in its embrace, and you feel in the quality of this cold a suggestion that the building itself has become continuous with the land, its stone and metal returning by slow degrees to the mineral condition from which human artifice temporarily extracted them. Around you, the merchants unload their cargoes in configurations so reduced that individual transactions can be observed in their entirety, each exchange a complete narrative of need and provision without the obscuring complexity of market aggregation. The last Yuan emperor, Toghon Timur, was born in 1320 and died in 1370, and his expulsion from China in 1368 and death in the Mongolian steppe 2 years later constitute the final chapter of the dynasty that Kublai established, a return to origins that mirrors in reverse the movement east that you have witnessed. You cannot foresee this distant conclusion, but in the patterns of your present observation you detect the seeds of future dissolution, the contradictions between nomadic heritage and sedentary empire that will eventually prove insupportable. The enduring cold of the steppe winter continues its governance, and you understand that this persistence constitutes a form of memory more reliable than any human record, the climate retaining in its patterns the trace of all that has passed across its surface. You place your hand upon one of these walls and feel in its temperature the convergence of human intention and natural process, the warmth that once distinguished inhabited from uninhabited space, having surrendered to the larger thermal equilibrium of the steppe. The cold air moves across your face, and in its movement you detect the particular quality that announces not merely weather, but season, the turning of the year toward conditions that will test the resilience of those who remain. The silence where Boucher's forge once rang has become a component of the larger silence that encompasses the city's former industrial quarter, and you walk through this silence as through a medium with its own density and resistance, your footsteps generating sounds that seem disproportionate to the effort that produces them. You turn for a last look at the silver tree in the great hall and find that you no longer possess the access that would permit this final observation, the doors having been secured against the depredations of weather and of those who might dismantle the remaining metal for more immediately useful purposes. Around you, the merchants unload their cargoes in the final stages of a journey that has brought them to the periphery rather than to the center of their intended destination, the displacement of imperial purpose having rendered their goods less valuable than the labor of transport would seem to warrant. The silence where Boucher's forge once rang has been replaced by the more general silence of the steppe, and in this replacement you detect the completion of a cycle whose beginning preceded your arrival and whose conclusion will extend beyond your departure. You settle into the rhythm of your own departure, and the hollow sound of wind in emptying courtyards yields to the deeper silence that precedes not the Khan's presence, but the deeper presence of sleep. And the last impressions that move across your consciousness include the memory of firelight on unfamiliar faces, the distant sound of a horse moving in the darkness, and the gradual recognition that the security which makes all this possible is itself the most precious and the most fragile of all the commodities that have converged upon this place.